All right, guys. So today I'm going to be reacting to the Brett Weinstein and Sargon of Akkad interview. I watched this Sunday night and I thought it was fascinating. They said a lot of very interesting and pertinent things in that interview. So I'm going to be reacting to that. I'm going to give you guys my thoughts. There's a lot to dig into there. And a brief synopsis on it. Basically, the entire interview is just them trying to understand and piece together why Nick Fuentes is becoming so popular and piece together what they think this means about the future of America. Now, the reason I'm reacting to this is because I have been contemplating my thoughts about Nick Fuentes over the past 3-4 weeks or so. And initially, when I started this channel, I was something of a right-wing ideologue. But as I began to grow and expand and contemplate my political beliefs, I begin to realize that surrendering yourself to any particular ideology is actually not the way to go in politics. The best thing to do is to embrace a mindset of constant change and evolution. And a lot of people find that difficult because it feels like if you do that, you're constantly abandoning principles, you're constantly abandoning beliefs, but that's not true. It's changing your perspectives on certain things. That's the important nuance to this. It's one thing to say I'm a liberal, now I'm a fascist. That's completely different. That's like a complete betrayal of your political disposition. But it is another thing to say I am a liberal, but here are the issues with liberalism. Maybe this is something about liberalism that could use some fine tuning. Maybe this is a limit with liberalism. I'm a nationalist, but maybe this is a limit with nationalism. Maybe there's a problem with nationalism. What are some of the contradictions between being a liberal and a nationalist? That is critical thinking. That's change and evolution. That's not betraying your political beliefs. And people on the internet do not understand this because people on the internet, especially people on Twitter who have Twitter brain, have such a one note way of viewing the world. And here's what I mean. The algorithm on YouTube and on Twitter trains your brain on a limited quantity of information. If you are constantly exposing yourself to Nick Fuentes, Sargon of Akkad, Richard Spencer, whoever else, if you are constantly exposing yourself to right-wing ideologues, what inevitably will happen is that you will begin to default to a certain set of talking points, and the algorithm will stunt your capacity to think critically, to think beyond those talking points, because your brain has been so rewired to think the way the algorithm has trained your brain to think. And I do not want to participate in that. And this is the reason why I'm going to start counter-signaling and being very critical of Nick Fuentes. It is my obligation, it is my responsibility to give you guys, as a content creator and a political, thinker, it is my responsibility to give you guys the insights and knowledge that I think is most amenable to having good politics, which means I have to be critical of certain people. Where me and Nick Fuentes converge, we'll agree. Where me and him diverge, I will criticize him. And you guys need to understand that. What is the point of me coming onto YouTube and being an ideological launderer for somebody else, or being an ideological enforcer for somebody else? Or worse than that, copying and pasting somebody's talking points, restating them, and then putting them on the internet. I will never be Nick Fuentes. I am not Nick Fuentes. And if I tried to be Nick Fuentes, I would fail because only Nick Fuentes can be Nick Fuentes. There's only one Nick Fuentes, the real Nick Fuentes. And I'm not him. I'm my own man with my own beliefs. I am Brandis Bonos. Nick Fuentes is somewhere in Illinois. So people who are groypers and fans of Nick Fuentes expect me to come on here and use my platform to echo all his talking points and never disagree with him. And the reason why is because their brains have been trained by the algorithm to default to defending or agreeing with everything that he says uncritically. They are literally not capable of critical thinking. And of course you're not, because you spend all day on Twitter and your brain has adapted and molded itself to think in short tweets, short, punchy, straight to the point talking points on Twitter that get you a lot of likes and engagement. So you guys are not capable of critical thinking. The groypers are not capable of critical thinking. You guys do not have that ability. You guys are not intelligent people. You guys are foolish people. And so the reason why I have to delineate myself from him is because there seems to be this misunderstanding that I am going to subscribe to everything the man says, and I'm just simply not going to. Now, here's the reason why I've become more skeptical of Nick Fuentes in recent days. For starters, Nick Fuentes is a white identitarian, he's a nationalist, and occasionally he calls himself a Christian nationalist. Now, here's what's ironic. He says he doesn't want to take away anybody's rights. He doesn't want to harm anybody. But he also doesn't believe in liberalism. He also doesn't believe in the democratic process. So this guy is a white nationalist. He's a Stalin and Hitler admirer. He constantly talks about how white people need power, and he doesn't believe in the democratic process. Now, excuse me, but that sounds a hell of a lot like Nazism. That sounds a hell of a lot like fascism. And you guys can quibble with me about, oh, he's saying Nazi, he's saying fascist, he's saying this, he's saying that. It's common sense. Listen to what he says. He's a Catholic integralist. He doesn't believe in the democratic process or liberalism. He's a nationalist, and he's a white identitarian. Now, this is the thing with Fuentes that pisses me off. He's a coward, and he pussyfoots around his beliefs. There is a clip of him circulating on Twitter. This was a few days ago. He was being interviewed by somebody at the airport. The guy asks him, Nick Fuentes, are you a white nationalist? And he says, something like that. Why not just say yes? Why not just say, yes, I am a white nationalist? And here's the problem. Regardless of all the things that me and Nick Fuentes agree on, regardless of all the problems that he and I may both accurately identify, the prescription to solving that problem is completely different. And that's ultimately what matters. If he believes a white fascist state is what's necessary to protect the interests of white people in America at the expense of others, I will never, under any circumstances, stand side by side with somebody like that. Ever, 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 under any circumstances. My prescription is fairness, reciprocity, understanding, communication. I do not believe that it's wise for America to be turned into a nation of competing groups with competing claims. My belief is that America should be a nation in which everybody is equal under the law and treated equally regardless of their inherited characteristics. It's very simple, and that we should strive towards that, and that we should strive towards being a nation of unified people, a unified nation. His belief is that that is impossible, and the only way to protect the interests of the white race is for them to acquire as much political power as possible and use that power to box out everybody else. That's literally what he believes. And for that reason, he and I will never stand shoulder to shoulder on anything. He and I will never see eye to eye on anything. We might agree on certain problems with wokeness, anti-whiteness, mass migration, racism. He and I might see eye to eye on those things and how there are certain excesses or outgrowths of racial politics that might be bad, But at the end of the day, he still believes that white people should hold all the cards in this country. Even if he believes that Wigger nationalism is bad, or being a Wignat, I think that's the term, is bad. And you guys have to understand, regardless of the memes, the jokes, the edginess, the charisma, none of that matters. The irony. If we're going to engage in sincere politics, and I believe that this is important, this is really important. In 2025, it is now cool to be edgy, ironic, racist. Okay, fine. But in that sea of racism, edginess, irony, there has to be some sincere voices. And I am going to be one of them. I am going to be a sincere actor. I am going to be genuine. And yes, that might get me flack. And yes, people might hate me for that. And yes, that'll put me in the crosshairs sometimes. And yes, maybe there might be some contradictions in what I believe. Occasionally. But I am going to strive to be genuine and sincere in the things that I say. I am not going to come on here and ideologically launder somebody else's beliefs and make them more palatable. I am not going to do that. I am my own man with my own beliefs. And I have significant criticisms and significant disagreements with Nick Fuentes. Significant. Major disagreements. Fundamentally, I still believe I am a liberal. I still believe in democracy. I still believe the government should be represented by the people. He does not. He believes the government should be represented by a small pool of people, white people, and the Christian or Catholic Church, whatever. Those are the people who should control society. And to that, I say, fuck no. Fuck no. I still believe in liberalism, equality, and democracy. And yes, I'm a nationalist. And so is he. And when I say I'm a nationalist, let me be very clear about what I mean. When I say I am a nationalist, what I mean is that I believe that it is the right of nations, which is to say peoples, it is the right of nations to defend their borders, to defend their sovereignty, and to defend their culture and identity above and before any global concerns or any concerns about individual freedom of movement. And that people should be expected upon arriving into those nations to assimilate and conform and be responsible. That is what I mean when I say I'm a nationalist, which is why I don't believe in mass migration. I do believe in mass deportations. I do believe in immigration restriction. I do understand that different nations have distinct cultures, which is to say, Muslims are not wholly compatible with our country, and they're prone to terrorism. And that's not to say the Muslims who live here can't stay. I do believe they can stay, and most of the Muslims who live here are fine. But it is to say you don't want to bring Muslims from Pakistan or Muslims from Iraq here in mass numbers because that increases cultural tensions and it increases the likelihood of terrorism. Now, I'm not saying we should be paranoid about all American Muslims. No. That's not what I mean. They're fine. They're here. They can stay. Many of them follow the law and practice their faith in peace. Most of them do. Vast majority of them do. But I do understand that nations do have distinct cultures with distinct identities and that those things should be respected and preserved. Now, here's where I diverge from Nick Fuentes. Nick Fuentes, as I've already said, is a white Christian nationalist. He says he's an American nationalist, a white identitarian, and a Christian nationalist. We can just say this guy's a white nationalist. Like, let's stop pussyfooting. Let's stop playing around with the terminology. Let's stop all this. We're going to exist in the realm of abstraction forever. Or we got to get the exact word for word verbatim definition. He's a white nationalist who believes that the country or the state should be informed by the Christian tradition or the Catholic Church. It's very simple what this guy believes. It's not complicated. And he believes that the nation of America should be dominated by white Christian men. And when we talk about his form of nationalism, it is exclusionary. My form of nationalism is inclusive. It's not exclusionary. I believe that Americans in America should preserve their culture and their borders and their way of life from people who are not from America, and should expect people to come to America and become American and identify as American and see themselves as American and have a commitment to defending this nation. Nick Fuentes, on the other hand, his form of nationalism is racial and religious. And that's a real problem for me, because he believes that white Christians should dominate the culture, the politics, the economics, and the social contours of our society at the exclusion of everybody else, and I don't agree with that. I have a fundamental disagreement with that. So anybody on here who thinks I'm going to see eye to eye with Fuentes or glaze him over everything, you might as well just fuck off now. You can stay and hear what I have to say, because I'm going to criticize him a lot. But I have serious problems with this guy, because the reason why is he is no longer just an edgy online shitposter on Kick or Cozy or Rumble. He's a major political figure now. At least he's being treated like one. And because of that, I am going to hold him to a much higher standard. I'm going to be much more scrupulous about how I talk about him and cover him, because it is my responsibility to do that. And people may not like that, but that's totally fine. This is not about you. So that's my whole spiel on Nick Fuentes, the whole white nationalist, white identitarian stuff. I'm not feeling that at all. I'm not feeling that at all. I understand that this country obviously descends from the Catholic Church, the Protestant faith, American Protestantism, congregational forms of Christianity, Greco-Roman philosophy, the British Empire. I understand all that, and all of that is integral to what the United States is. I would never deny that, and that it comes from Anglo-Saxons predominantly, with the help of some Western Europeans as well. And I would never deny that. I am not dumb enough or ignorant enough to deny that, and I don't even have an issue with that. I think there's a lot of good things about English culture. But I do not think that the solution then is to say everybody else who's come here post-1965 should now be treated as less American or be deprived of their national identity or their nationhood. Or should be deprived of their ability to contribute to the political future of this country. That I don't agree with. And that's something that he does agree with. And if you watch his show is basically, look guys, I've been watching this guy's show every night for the past 6 or 7 months. And it's funny because my friend Luis actually introduced me to Nick Fuentes. Luis is Guatemalan. Huge Nick Fuentes fan, which is perplexing to me. But I've been watching this guy's show for the past 6-7 months now. And you can basically summarize his show by discussing 5 central things. Basically, his entire political ideology is, or his entire show is, there's too many non-whites in America, black people commit too much crime, and black culture is a problem. Women have too much freedom, and the sexual revolution needs to be ended. Israel and Jews have too much control over our society, and white Christian men need to be in power. That's basically his show. That is basically his entire show. Oh, and white genocide. That's basically this guy's entire show. And at a certain point where I'm at now, you only need so much to understand what this guy thinks and where he's coming from. It becomes pretty obvious after a certain point. And now it's time for somebody to step up and hold him to account, criticize his views, challenge his views, because I think there's a lot of issues with the movement that he represents and the ideology that he is engendering into the masses. And we all need to be very skeptical of him. And here's the thing. The last thing I'll say before I get into the video, because this has been a long monologue. Let me make one thing clear. The Groypers are with Nick. The young white men, the Groypers, the angry people, the bitter people, the pro-white people, they're with Nick. Okay, I have the chances of me being able to convince these people with rational or logical argumentation, it's not going to work. It's impossible. They're mind raped by Nick Fuentes. So all the Groypers and all the people who are huge Nick Fuentes stans, and that's what this is. This is stan culture. And it's ironic that these people think celebrity culture is cringe and stan culture for celebrities is cringe, but they stan Nick Fuentes, their internet god. But anyways, last thing I'm going to say is, you know, I have no ability. There's nothing I can do to convince people who are loyal to Nick Fuentes and his message and share his ideology to take my position. There's just no way. It's impossible. It's not going to work. And you guys can go jack him off. You guys can go do your thing over there. Don't come here. Don't leave comments. Just fuck off. It's the people who are skeptical about Nick Fuentes. It's the people who are on the fence about Nick Fuentes. It's the black people, the Hispanic people, even some of the white people, the Asian people. It's those people who are skeptical about this guy who think, yeah, you know, he says some things that are accurate and he's kind of funny and he's kind of charismatic. But, you know, I'm very skeptical about a lot of this racial politics that seem to be so central to his message. It is those people who I'm trying to recruit. It is those people who I'm trying to convince. It is those people who I'm trying to persuade. The Groypers, the white guys, the Gen Z white guys, even some of the Gen Z white girls. You know, you guys, I don't even know what to say to a lot of you guys. You guys are with, if you guys are with Nick, you're with Nick. There's nothing I can do to convince you. But to everybody else who's skeptical, I'm begging you, try to see things from my perspective. You know, I feel like I've got him clocked for the most part. But anyways, that's that. Enough of me. We're going to get into this reaction. We're going to do a lot of analyzing with this reaction because there's a lot of stuff here. But that's my monologue. I appreciate you guys for listening. Let's go ahead and switch gears. And also, this is the last thing I'm going to say before I start this reaction, because this is a long video. Nick Fuentes and I have a fundamental difference of worldview in regards to how we approach the relationships between humans and the politics that take place within nation states. I have a much more material, which is to say, I have a much more grounded or pragmatic or tangible way of understanding how the world works, whereas his way of understanding how the world works is clash of civilizations almost. So a prime example of this would be, he thinks that African migrants and Muslims and Jews and Indians and Asians and whoever else, all these different groups of people coming to America will come here and destroy the country and genocide the white race, and that's the reason why white birth rates are falling. That's what he believes. He believes that neoliberal open border policies are allowing third worlders to come in here, and they're here genociding white people, killing white people, destroying white culture. They're going to get rid of Christmas. They're going to kill the white race. And that's the reason why white people are going to be dispossessed in America and stop having children. I shit you not, that's literally what he believes. And he went on a 30-minute, 45-minute screed about this on Friday. And I hear that, and it's important to understand, when you listen to someone like Nick Fuentes, He is trying to flood your limbic system. He is trying to make you hysterical. He's trying to make you scared. He's trying to paint this dark, everybody's coming to kill us mindset into your mind because it makes you easier to manipulate. And once he has planted a seed of fear and existential horror into your mind, that's when you become more susceptible to his talking points. But for a sharp mind like my own, for a shrewd man like myself, that kind of stuff doesn't work on me because I'm a tactful and discerning individual who operates at a different caliber of intellectualism than the masses. So for me, I listen to this and I think there's a very simple and obvious explanation for the declining birth rates. And if it was so simple that you could describe it as being a byproduct of mass migration, why is Japan experiencing its lowest birth rates in 50 years? In 2025, they reported under 700,000 births, and there are 125 million people living in that country. Now, let's understand something. Japan is an island. They are a civilization that goes back thousands of years. They are culturally and linguistically homogenous, ethnically homogenous, religiously homogenous, and yet they are not having any children despite having some of the most restrictive immigration policies on earth. So if they're not having children and there's no immigrants coming to that country, what is another potential confounding variable that is leading to that? The answer is simple. It is industrialization. It is inflation. It is the fact that housing is no longer affordable. It is the fact that people who are more educated, who have careers, are less likely to have children, which is obvious. This is just obvious. If you have a career, if you're working 40, 50, 60 hours a week at a high-powered finance job, you're probably not going to have as much time or attention to give to a child, especially 2 or 3 or 4 children. Whereas somebody who's poor and lives in the countryside and has a very monotonous, non-dynamic day-to-day life is more likely to have several children, on top of the fact that people who are poor typically make irresponsible decisions. So the declining birth rates in this country can be assigned to industrialization. They can be assigned to inflation. They can be assigned to the demand for dual income houses. They can be assigned to economic factors. Not black people and brown people and whoever else coming to America and genociding white people. He has this fantastical belief that black people and brown people are just out and about killing white people willy-nilly, just genociding white people. And it's like, no, black people, Hispanic people, Asian people who live here are doing the same things that humans have been doing for thousands of years, working, rearing children, taking care of their homes, trying to survive, trying to acquire food and acquire resources. That's literally it. And just because they don't look the same as you does not mean they're not doing those things. It's so retarded, this hyper-online idea that non-white people living in America are just out genociding white people. It's the most retarded thing ever. And if you are a retard and if you are a mental midget, you'll fall for it, as many of you will, unfortunately. But I will not, because I am intellectually shrewd, intellectually fortified, psychologically fortified. And you probably are not, but that's okay. You can work on that. But that's why I don't take the bait on these sorts of things. There's very obvious explanations for why this is happening. And to blame us for it is the most ridiculous thing on earth. There seems to be this idea from Fuentes that the entire earth revolves around white people. And the moment white people are no longer a majority in America, that technology will stop, AI will stop, the seasons will stop, the earth will stop, the sun will stop, everything will stop the moment white people become a minority in America. Time will stop. cultural and human evolution will stop. Everything will just stop. And it's like, no, actually, humans will continue to do the same exact things that they've been doing for thousands of years. Working, having children, handling their obligations, trying to survive, trying to reproduce, trying to improve their circumstances. He thinks like this is only a white people trait, which goes to show how little he thinks of the rest of us. And this is something that I just find so ridiculous. It's so ridiculous. It's so laughable. If this guy genuinely gave a fuck about the white birth rate, he would be telling white men and white women, have a regular job, live within your means, be financially responsible, move somewhere in Texas or Georgia or Alabama or Mississippi or Wisconsin or Michigan, move into a cheap suburban single-family home, have 3 children, and leave it at that. But that's not what he's saying. He's blaming everybody else because he has a political agenda. He's blaming my people. He's blaming Hispanics. He's blaming blacks. Like, do you think the majority of blacks are like just out here trying to kill white people, really? If you're online 24/7, as I'm sure most of you are, that's probably what you think. And I'm sorry that I'm coming off so flippant and so smug, but it's just like the stupidity of his followers leaves me dumbfounded. And how susceptible people are to propaganda, especially when it comes attached to race, and how easy people are to manipulate. It's very sad. It says a lot about our educational system. It says a lot about the state of our society. But what the last thing I'll say, and then I'll continue because this is I'm going on too long. The last thing I'll say is just this. It's important to know if you're a black person, an Asian person, a Mexican person, if we got genocided tomorrow, if minorities in this country got genocided tomorrow, they might shed crocodile tears about it. Nick Fuentes might say, oh, that's sad, that's tragic. But at the end of the day, he would see it as a net benefit. He would see it as a net win. Because he doesn't look at the world through the lens of universal principles, equality, trying to build a positive society. He views the world as tribes competing with tribes, races competing with races, religions competing with religions. He doesn't believe in the capacity for cooperation at the national level between multiple races and multiple religions. He doesn't believe in that. He doesn't think that's possible. And so you must understand, if you are not a white person who is in this country, in America, if you got genocided tomorrow, he would find that to be a positive development. Yeah, he might shed some crocodile tears. Oh, I'm a Catholic, I'm a Christian, whatever. That's what all of them would say. But long term, they would see it as a net benefit. They'd see it as a net win. And if you're a minority here, you have to understand the card that you have been dealt. You're a minority. I'm a minority. You have to be conscious of that when you engage in politics. And this is not, no offense to the white viewers here. Nothing against you guys. Seriously. You guys are fine. I've never had an issue with white people or anybody for that matter. This is about Fuentes and his ideology and his followers. If we got genocided tomorrow, black people, Hispanic people, any non-white person in this country, he might think that's bad. He might think that's wrong. He might say that's evil, or if we got deported or mass arrested or something like that, or remigrated or forcibly removed from the country, he might say that's bad, that's wrong. But he would see that as a net benefit. He sees you not being here as a net asset or a net win for his political ideology. So just keep that in mind. There's very little remorse that they have for you or your families. So anyways, that's that. We're going to get into this video. We're going to get into this reaction. Enough of my spiel. Let's get right into it.
Hey folks, welcome to the Dark Horse Podcast Inside Rail. I have the distinct pleasure of sitting today with Carl Benjamin. It is early afternoon for me. It is middle of the evening for him because he's in England. In any case, this is a podcast, well, not this particular podcast, but I've wanted to do a podcast with Carl for a very long time, and I will say a little bit more about that. But in the meantime, let me just say, Carl, welcome to Dark Horse.
Thank you so much. I've been long anticipating doing a podcast with you as well. As we were saying just before we started, I've been following your work for a very long time. And I very much appreciated your work during COVID, because honestly, it was quite brave to go so far out of the consensus. And I'm nothing of an expert on that particular subject in any way, shape, or form. So it was nice to see someone who was prepared to just take the knocks and say, no, I really do think that this is the case, actually.
Well, thank you for saying that. I will say I did not at the time know whether or not I would ever find my way back to the acceptable circles. I'm not sure I'm all the way back there yet, but nonetheless, I will also say, though, I became aware of your work in 2017, it would have been, when Evergreen was actually in the midst of melting down, if I remember correctly. And you, in your other persona, Sargon of Akkad, released an analysis of the meltdown at Evergreen that I thought was incisive. You were also very early to that story. So at the point that I had no idea what anyone was going to make of it, you showed up, and I took quite a bit of solace in hearing that somebody across the pond could see exactly what was going on and just call it out without hedging. So it's long overdue, but thank you for that.
It was my pleasure, honestly.
Well, in the years since then, speaking of taking knocks, you have taken a tremendous number. You have been derided in all sorts of terms, and you have also been impeded. You've been thrown off of, I'm trying to remember the history. It's so long ago now, but were you thrown off of Twitter?
I was in 2017, and in 2022, Elon brought me back. So I'm very, very pleased.
And I also recall there was some interesting situation. Was it Patreon threw you off for behavior?
I was indeed banned from Patreon as well.
Yeah. So, but you were thrown off, if I'm remembering the story correctly, for things you said somewhere that had nothing to do with Patreon. Is that right?
Yeah. At the time, I was a liberal, and very much like what is happening now with the sort of Nick Fuentes fans. I was being attacked by a bunch of what are essentially just Twitter Nazis. And to be honest with you, this is the first time it had really happened. So I was a bit stressed. I was under quite a lot of pressure. And I was on someone else's stream, and I'd shouted at some of them in the chat in a very unflattering way. And the chaps at Patreon took exception to that, and they were like, nope. Which is strange because it wasn't on their platform. But they just didn't like it, and that was that.
Yeah, so you have faced the onslaught of various types of coercion and control. In any case, what I wanted to talk to you about today is Nick Fuentes. You're probably not aware, but I've been trying to get people to have a different discussion about Nick Fuentes. My feeling is it is very easy to fall into the trap of seeing clips of him saying truly inflammatory things which I find despicable, and to imagine that tells you who he is and what he's about. And I know that that's not accurate, because somehow a couple of years ago, I did something on Twitter. I did what I always do, which is go looking into quadrants where I'm not usually expected to show up to hear what the conversations amongst other people sound like. And I somehow triggered something in the algorithm that caused me to be thrown into what I call Nazi Twitter, where you had people openly discussing a complete revision of the collective understanding of Hitler, the Holocaust, World War II, etc. And I was spooked by it. I did a podcast where I tried to alert people that this is happening, and you're probably not seeing it if the algorithm doesn't think you'll like it. But it's happening, and it's not a tiny number of people, and you need to know it's there. But in that episode, something caused me to start seeing Nick Fuentes show up, and I found him fascinating because he is charismatic, he's insightful, and he obviously was saying a great many things that are unspeakable in polite society, many of which are grotesque, but some of which are simply things that need to be said and are not being discussed anywhere. So I have deeply mixed feelings about what I see there, but I know that it's a mistake to simply see the inflammatory clips and assume that that's what's going on. It really isn't. And so you put out a piece, maybe it was yesterday or the day before, in which you analyzed the Nick Fuentes phenomenon, which is to say not just who is this person and why is he saying these things, but why is it resonating so broadly amongst Zoomers? And I thought your piece was excellent. So I wanted to have you on to articulate your position and for you and me to talk about what we agree about, maybe what we disagree about. This episode of the Dark Horse Inside.
Nope. No ads. Not doing that.
Decline.
I might speed this up to 1.25, and if not, I'll speed it up to 1.5 because it's kind of slow.
Incel function. My point is it should be at for 50%.
Excuse me. Before we begin, I think it's worth pointing out that
.com/.
Much better.
So before we begin, I think it's worth pointing out that I know the area of Twitter you're talking about. Excuse me. I've had a dreadful cough for the past month or so. I know the area of Twitter you're talking about, and I just want to be clear about what my position on all of this is. I personally have got no interest or desire for any kind of Holocaust revisionism, any kind of Holocaust denial. I've absolutely got no sympathy with Nazi Germany or anything like that. As far as I'm concerned, I'm an Englishman. My side with the British during World War II. My ideology is pretty, I mean, I don't really consider myself to hold an ideology. I just tried to make sure that I'm being driven literally in a sensible manner, as in through the sense datum and through reasonable analysis of what I see. So I am not in any way sympathetic to the ideology they're constructing in that area of Twitter. But like you, I think it's important to understand what is happening and why. And what I've found, I've finished a degree and a master's degree in philosophy. And a lot of people ask me, why did you do philosophy? And honestly, the ability to untangle layers is the real reason. Because you'll notice that people treat Nick Fuentes in the ideological layer. And in the ideological layer, the things he says are so offensive to the standard ideology of almost everyone in the West, on the left or the right, conservative or liberal. It's understood that, of course, we're the good guys in World War II, the bad guys were defeated, and we all lived happily ever after. And so when Nick Fuentes says things like Hitler is cool, he is attacking on the ideological layer all of the sacred cows of the post-World War II consensus. He is turning the entire thing on its head and saying, well, this is the problem, is that basically the West doesn't think Hitler is cool. And this is heresy. This is just an outright heresy to this ideological level of belief. But then if you actually think about what you're looking at, well, Nick Fuentes, and I'm just to be clear, I haven't got any personal beef with the man, or I don't personally dislike him even. Like you, I've seen the clips going around, and I agree with your assessment. He's lucid, he's funny, he's sharp-witted, and he's a very clear communicator, very good communicator. So you can see why, to an audience of dispossessed young men, you can see why he would be a very appealing figure. But if you actually look at him, he's not terribly physically impressive. He is not a titanic speaker like Adolf Hitler or anything like this. What he is a young man with a microphone who's prepared to transgress boundaries in order to make a point, in order to make himself heard. And so the ideological layer is the layer everyone engages with him on. But I've noticed that, I mean, I don't know about yourself. I'm a father. I've got a few other content creator friends who are also fathers, and we couldn't help but watch his interview with Piers Morgan through the lens of parents listening to rebellious children, and the rebellious children were really attacking the established worldview of the parents, because I think what was really underlying it is the message that actually the old worldview of the Piers Morgan types just doesn't work for the world in which these young men live. And I think the most important part of the whole thing was actually when Nick Fuentes says, yes, I'm a racist. And I think that a lot of people fail to understand what that really means and why that is something that actually resonates with a lot of people. Now, Piers Morgan, in particular, grew up in an England that was 95+% white English. So everywhere you went, it was just English people all over the place. And you would have to go and look for those small areas of England, in not even cities, just in parts of cities, that had a significant density of non-English people in them. And so when you have that kind of background stability, obviously being a racist seems like a horrible and malicious thing that is irrational, is completely irrational to say, well, hang on a second, why would you be mean to the chap who runs the Chinese restaurant or something like that? He's not doing anything wrong. What would be the reason other than your own personal hatred, which obviously is completely true and makes sense. But I think a lot of the Zoomer men now are living in countries that are actually highly diversified. They don't have, and America was very much the same in this sort of era, like much, much higher percentage white American of European descent. And that it makes a lot more sense when that kind of background assumption obtains. But when it doesn't, and you're thrown into a world where you've got lots of different competing groups that are all expected to occupy the same space, then I think Fuentes is probably more correct than not when he says, well, everyone is racist. Because what he means is all of these different groups are demonstrating an in-group preference towards themselves. And as the young white men, well, they're looking around and saying, well, okay, well, do we have an in-group that we can have a preference for? Because everyone else seems to be getting ahead on this understanding. And if we're denied that, that makes us vulnerable in the world that the Piers Morgans of the world have created. And so I think this is a genuine shift that is not going to go away, whether we like it or not.
Well, I
see that right there is the problem, because there's an element of truth in what he's saying, insofar as he's saying in a liberal democracy that's multiracial, people are exercising voting behaviors and political behaviors that are, that demonstrate a kind of in-group preference towards their own race or ethnicity or religion or whatever. And that is true. Largely, you do see that kind of spread when you look at voting patterns across the United States. People are overwhelmingly voting Democrat because the Democrats appeal to the sensibilities of minorities. But that has a lot to do, one, with building coalitions. Two, Trump, to his credit, I think he had the most number of Hispanic voters or black voters, I think even just minority voters in general, in like the past, of any Republican in the past several decades. So there's something there. There's something to be said about it. There's something about policy. There's something about charisma. There's something about standing in opposition to extreme neoliberal or extreme woke policies that resonate even with minorities. It's not as cut and dry as people try to make it out to seem, where it's just every ethnic group is just vying for themselves. It's not. That's lazy analysis. That's not correct. That doesn't suffice. But beyond that, on a more, I guess, philosophical or meta-political level, you have to look at this in the context of game theory. And game theory, maybe you guys are familiar with this, maybe you aren't, but game theory is essentially, it refers to a dilemma in which every party is given a series of options, and they can either pursue what is in their best short-term self-interest whilst sacrificing other players, or they can accrue short-term losses but cooperate with other players to compromise for what's in their collective long-term interest. And there's something called a Nash equilibrium here, where the constant process of engaging in a political, in a form of politics where you are only ever considering what is in your own short-term interest, basically incentivizes everybody else to do the same thing. So you guys take turns throwing each other under the bus in perpetuity, effectively. However, when everybody kind of adopts or tries to adopt a race-neutral perspective, or kind of focus on what is in the collective interest of this nation, people might make short-term sacrifices for their own racial or religious group, but they will make long-term gains. And what we're seeing here is, long-term, I don't think the Nick Fuentes, America First, white identitarian movement is the way to go long term. I don't think that's good long term. Maybe there is some short term benefit to it. I don't know. Maybe we'll see. But long term, I don't think this is the way to go, because all this does is incentivize non-white people or whoever else to then do the same thing and take their own side and act in their own short-term self-interest and perpetuity as well. It destroys any kind of good faith. In order to disrupt this equilibrium, it will require a universal disengagement, which is to say, it will require blacks, Hispanics, Asians, Jews, and whites all simultaneously to resign from engaging in a form of politics that is exclusionary and racially motivated. And until that happens, we're going to continue to have these problems forever. So that's my reasoning.
I resonate with a lot of what you said. I want to go back and just put my own perspective on the table here in a couple places. I do have a beef with Nick Fuentes. What that beef is depends a little bit on what is motivating him, which I don't think I fully understand yet. My beef with him is that many of the things that he says are, even if he himself is being ironic or transgressing for its own purpose, the tropes that he is playing with are so dangerous that I think he has a responsibility to stay away from them. And even if I embrace his instinct to transgress, there are certain places that you mustn't go because of fundamental defects of humanity and what may obtain if he legitimizes those perspectives, even if it's not his intent. So,
see, this is bad rhetoric from Brett. He doesn't understand. Like, first off, there's just the basic optics of it. This guy is a Jew. He's a professor. He's well off. And he's telling a generation of men who feel as if they've been dispossessed, in this case, predominantly white men who feel like they've been dispossessed, to ease up, stop with the tropes. This guy's dangerous, but he's the only one who's really advocating on their behalf. He doesn't understand this is not an effective approach. You have to understand the science behind this movement. And if you want to appeal, I guess, to his followers on some level, which I don't even know if that's possible at this point. I think it's virtually impossible. Maybe it's possible. I don't know. But if you want to appeal to his followers at this point, if you're Brett, you have to have a sit-down, face-to-face discussion with Fuentes, and you'll have to pick apart at his ideas and get into the internal contradictions with them, because you're not going to be able to police the audience and tone police, or police their consciousness or consciences about behavior that you consider to be transgressive or dangerous in regards to certain tropes. That's not going to work at this point when there's all this pent-up anger and resentment and frustration. It's not going to work, especially when they feel like their situation is existential. It's just, this rhetoric is not going to work. I don't know why this is. You have to take a different approach here. You actually have to confront the inconsistency of the ideology head on. You can't just, it's not enough to just say this is dangerous.
My beef with him is that he has a responsibility. On the other hand, he's 27 years old. And
if you're going to say it's dangerous, you can't just say it's because of the tropes. You actually have to diagnose why it's dangerous.
I remember being that age, and I have two kids, boys, one 21, one 19, and I recognize in them the tendency to transgress. And so what I'm hoping is that he is being ironic and that he actually can be brought to an understanding of the dangers of some of the territories in which he is playing. But I don't know. That remains to be seen. As for the issue of racism, I suspect you and I will land in about the same place. I still am a liberal. I absolutely believe in a formally colorblind West. I don't think we should be policing what people say and think. We should be persuading, correcting them when they say things that are wrong. But the maddening situation that Gen Z finds itself in, especially Gen Z straight white males, is that they have had their hands
colorblind. That's an interesting position. Formerly colorblind West. I don't know if most people who are on Nick Fuentes' side of the spectrum would agree with this being, or even agree with the idea of a formerly colorblind West. I don't think you're going to be able to sell them on that pitch, and for good reason. I mean, I think they're jaded on it. I think they have good reason to be jaded about it. I don't think it's something worth giving up on. It's something I still believe in, but I think liberalism has been seriously eroded. And let's just be real, neoliberals did that to themselves. Neoliberals destroyed liberalism. Not classical liberals, not traditional liberals, neoliberals destroyed liberalism. And this is something that Patrick Deneen talks about, but radical individualism and the sexual revolution, free trade, open borders, the managerial class, and rule by NGOs and technocrats, and Silicon Valley and the oligarchy. This is what neoliberalism has given us. It has destroyed this country, literally destroyed this country. And in the process has created an extremely divided society on the basis of radical individualism and subnational identities. So I don't know how you put that. I don't know how you put that genie back in the bottle in regards to a colorblind West. I think people are so stratified at this point here. It's hard to see that ever fully being realized. That to me is just, I don't know if that's even possible. But I mean, I agree. It's a notion I agree with. I think we should strive for that. But I think the whole colorblind thing, I don't know if that's, I feel like that term is now loaded now. I feel like that term is so loaded. What we should be approaching is fairness. I think fairness is what we should be striving towards, because colorblind, you're kind of asking people to dismiss obvious patterns of behavior that they see with particular groups. Like if a certain group disproportionately commits crime or disproportionately enters the country illegally or owns a disproportionate amount of the media, you can't ask people to be colorblind to that, because you're asking them to willfully engage in cognitive dissonance or to be willfully ignorant, and that doesn't work. What we need to be thinking about is fairness. What is fair? Not what is colorblind, what goes along with this colorblind ideology, but what is fair, right? Because colorblind is kind of a loaded word. I like the idea or the sentiment behind colorblind, because we're going to assess people's character and merit as opposed to their race, but you also understand that there are collectives, there are groups within this country that do express a certain culture and certain patterns of behavior that might be problematic at times. And to say, we have this colorblind ideology, you can't call that out, that doesn't work anymore.
Hands tied behind their backs, right? You people have a position of privilege and you must be constrained. And everybody else has been freed to engage in all kinds of things, including rampant racism of exactly the sort that boiled over at Evergreen. And so we have a double standard. The double standard is we are going to enable your racism if you come from some group that we consider downtrodden, and we are going to prosecute every offense, no matter how minor or even if it's just imagined, if you happen to come from a group that is privileged. And so Gen Z, straight white males, are facing demonization for their privilege, as they are experiencing no privilege at all. In fact, the opposite, right? They have been constrained. Others have been liberated, and they're being told that their situation is so good that their disadvantage is necessary to level a playing field that's already slanted against them. Is that fair from your perspective?
Yeah, no, I think that's perfectly fair, and I think a large part of the position of the Zoomers at this point is, I think a lot of them feel betrayed, frankly, by the promises liberals have made, and then the actions and world that they've brought about. There was no colorblind meritocracy for them. For them, there was a very color conscious and how to put it, hierarchical world in which they were born, and they were specifically and deliberately put at the bottom of it through no fault of their own. And I'm in many ways, I consider myself to be a post-liberal at this point because I've done too much philosophical work on liberalism to be able to adhere to it. But
really, Sargon, please share with us what philosophical work have you done on liberalism, sir? Please share with us your theses on this, your graduate theses on this. I'd be fascinated to hear what that consists of. Because people make this mistake, like when we talk about liberalism, it's a very simple idea. It is not complicated. There is lowercase l liberalism and neoliberalism. Lowercase l liberalism is, simply put, the idea that we believe everybody should be treated on the basis of individuals, or on the basis of their individuality, not as collectives. We believe in equality, and we believe that everybody, or rights, are assigned to individuals, not groups, and that those rights should be protected by the state. It's like a very basic proposition. We assess people on the basis of their individual merit. We believe everybody's an individual. We believe rights belong to individuals, and that the state should protect those rights. And we believe in equality amongst all individuals. So it's a very basic idea. It's not contradictory whatsoever. And like I said, Patrick Deneen makes a clear distinction between classical liberalism and neoliberalism. And neoliberalism consists of 4 pillars: open borders and radical individual freedom, which is to say freedom of movement between borders, a kind of post-national ideology. So freedom of movement, open borders, free markets, and people should have as much economic choice and economic freedom as possible. So free markets. They believe in the sexual revolution and individual freedom, radical individual expression. There should be no constraints on individual, expression of the individual, and their culture and their identity, whether it's transgender or gay or whatever else. And if you're a woman, you should be able to wear whatever you want, this kind of sexual revolution. And then lastly, rule of the managerial and technocratic class. This is neoliberalism in a nutshell. And those are all things that I reject. So he's probably saying he rejects neoliberalism, not classical liberalism, because there's significant differences.
I think I'm most interested in fairness now. I think I'm most interested in, rather than any kind of abstract set of ideologies, is what people feel to be fair. And I think that we can all agree that the young men of today are not being treated fairly. They are the product of the sort of feminist civilization that we were calling attention to back in the 2000s. Well, we're now more than a decade on from that civilization and its works. And well, what do we have? We have a very large cohort of very radical young men who have decided that this civilization is there to destroy them or to harm them or to treat them as a servant class, and they'd rather tear it down. And so the question is, well, what do we do from this point onwards? Because in many ways they have a really legitimate point, which is against people of our age and older, and that's, why did you let them do this to us? You, the older generations, have a responsibility in a kind of Burkean sense on the great chain of being to make sure that the world that you're bringing into existence for younger people to grow up in is a good and fair one. And we didn't. And I don't think, I mean, that's our fault, obviously, but it wasn't, it's only in hindsight this becomes exceedingly obvious, because at the time, I think everyone was very blindsided by the highly sophisticated ideological weapons of social justice. And people didn't really know how to actually combat it. It's taken us a long time to play catch up. But that doesn't change the failure on our part, and it doesn't salve any of the wounds that the Zoomers currently carry. And so it really, I think, is actually forcing the question of what is it that they are owed by society, actually? What are the young men of the West actually owed in comparison to all of the minority groups that have been privileged above them? And the answers can get quite reactionary, actually, whether you like them or not. There is a kind of logical implication in a lot of it that suggests actually these men should have been incorporated into the power structures, into the hierarchies, not just for themselves either, but actually for everyone else. Jordan Peterson makes this point quite regularly, or used to before he fell ill, obviously, that the kind of men that women want to marry are not men who earn less than they do. And so, great point. Well, why do women make up the majority of people in universities? Why are women being fast-tracked into the upper echelons of businesses then? This is, it might be immediately gratifying, but in the long run, when polled, even women will say, well, I'd rather if the man earned more money than me, and so I could eventually have children and take care of them while he provides. And I don't want to say, right, okay, so we need some sort of a hard right-wing world or anything, but there is a kind of natural order here that the feminist paradigm attacked, that the Zoomers are really just making actually quite a reasonable request is, could we just live naturally, please? Now, I think they're not articulating this very well, but I think in their defense, people probably wouldn't have listened if it wasn't for some reactionary and very transgressive figurehead grabbing the attention. If they were asking very politely, and they may well have been asking very politely for a long time, nobody listened.
Well, I'm going to correct one thing that you said.
Go ahead.
You said we.
Fair.
Right? And the fact is, I believe that you can kind of divide, you've got the transgressive for its own sake stuff. Let's put that aside. And then you've got the critique of the way Western civilization is being run, which I think is incisive. But it comes in two parts. There's the what have you done to us, in which there are many devastating points to be made that are now being made because somebody has decided to just pay the price of saying them and let the chips fall where they're made. And then there's the question of what to be done about it, where I don't find them incisive. And in fact, in your piece, you call this out specifically. But with respect to the question of we, I feel no responsibility whatsoever for what has happened to these people because I fought it, as did you. And my feeling is this is the point where the people who fucked this up need to step aside, right? There now needs to be a conversation between those of us who did stand up for the rights of straight white men and have been demonized for it and for many other imagined crimes, right? That's the conversation that needs to happen. Those of us who understood this was a mistake and opposed it need to now have a conversation with those who are tearing up the system because they have no investment in it. That isn't their fault. They were betrayed. It's not just that they feel it. They were betrayed by this system and they've had enough of it, understandably. And I also hear in what you're saying, your issue is fairness. Yeah, mine too. In fact, I think you are not talking about the West unless you are talking about a level playing field. An level playing field does not mean one in which we, count the number of people of various skin colors in various professions and go around equalizing things. When you make an appeal to living naturally, that's the point. You have to formally have the right to get somewhere based on merit. And then whether you choose you want to go in that direction or not is up to you. And your final point, I think, is excellent, and it's devastating. Civilization liberates individuals. Western civilization does so. It is the strongest argument in favor of it. But it cannot liberate individuals in a way that destroys the system that protects them to be free. And to the extent that we have run a radical experiment by taking all of the logic out of the male-female dynamic, what we've done is we've created a self-defeating civilization. And that is not an argument against I'm speaking purely for myself here. That is not an argument against women being welcomed at all layers of civilization. However, I want to make a point that I first arrived at in the realm of science. Science used to be a boys' club. That is galling. If you're a woman and you have an interest in doing science, it's galling not to be allowed in. However, at the point that women arrive in the land of science, we are not benefited if the rules of how science is done are rewritten in a feminine mode, because what makes science work is holding each other's feet to the fire. So the point is, if you want to do science, you've got to do it by the rules that work, which happen to be more boy-like than girl-like, right? Reflexive support has no place in a science lab. You can want your fellows to succeed, and the way that you make them more powerful is to call them out when they're making logical errors so that they get stronger, right? That male mode has to be democratized, and everybody in science has to play by those rules in order for science to work at all. And so I would say the larger dynamic is the same one. We can't feminize civilization, because a feminized civilization is not going to survive. Civilization has to function. Everybody should be free to aspire to whatever roles they want, but the rules that govern that role have to be ones that are sensible from the point of view of the civilization continuing, defending itself, achieving the objectives that we've agreed on. And I see exactly the opposite unfolding. So I don't know how many of us there are that have stood up for those principles or similar ones, but I think we need to come forward now and say, actually, their gripe is correct. And those of us who wouldn't have allowed this to happen are probably the ones who should be doing the talking.
Our second sponsor for this episode is brand new to us, but we've been using their products for years. They are Uplift Standing Desks. By now, everyone...
Yeah, that's a good point that he makes when he talks about we, because not everybody is included in this neoliberal, anti-white movement. Like, that's the thing that these people don't understand. It's like such a zero-sum mindset. It's like it's us versus everybody else. It's like, dude, no, it's not. No, it's not, buddy. Like, you can chill out. Like, not everybody wants to kill you. Not everybody hates you. Not everybody wants to steal from you. Not everybody wants to steal from your home. Get off of Twitter. Talk to real people. Most of us want to get along and cooperate. Like, this shit is ridiculous. It is so utterly ridiculous. And if you spend any time engaging in the real world, you would understand this. Yes, there are problems with people's political disposition. There are problems with people's political motivations. I would never disagree with that. But what these groypers do, and these white identitarians like Nick Fuentes and everybody else do, is they lump all of us into this bad basket of anti-white, pro-mass migration. And that's just not true. Like, not every Hispanic, I don't even say the majority, a significant number of Hispanic, Black, Jewish, whatever else, white, anybody for that matter, people do not agree with this kind of outgrowth or excess of neoliberal and woke ideology. Most of us hate that shit. What we're looking for is just a society that's harmonious and cooperative. And they're trying to basically reduce us all down to this like existential threat or this enemy, so that they have a pretext to be as radical and aggressive as possible. And it's just very disingenuous. So I'm glad that Brett Weinstein made that point, because yeah, this is not a we thing. Not all of us are included in this problem.
Get yourself an Uplift desk. You won't be sorry.
I agree with you. I think the way that I look at these things these days is through the lens of justice. I'm not trying to critique what you've just said, but I can't help but hear a couple of liberal words, ideological words in there. And it's only because of my sort of having spent so much time in the weeds with liberalism that I think there are other ways of framing things that allow us to avoid some of the traps that liberalism falls into. So like I said, meritocracy is one of those words where I instinctively agree with the word, right? I instinctively agree with the concept. But then you get the left playing strange games with the term. Same with freedom, frankly, and equality. Like in isolation, obviously everyone wants to be free and equal to the people around them. Obviously, this is not a conversation you need to have. But these terms can be treated as if they have a kind of divine sanction. And therefore they become the thing that comes before all of the actual real world considerations when you look and go, okay, well, is this actually good? And it's like, well, no, but we are free, but we are equal, but we are meritorious, we are this, we are that. It's like, okay, but if it isn't good, how useful is it actually to have these things? And maybe we're doing more harm than we ought to be doing. And so I try to look at it through the lens of justice, just as Aristotle describes it, just people getting what they are due, people getting what they actually deserve. And so, yeah, if you have a woman who works very hard in science, she gets her degree, she gets her master's, she gets her PhD, she works in the lab, she just makes some discoveries, there's no justification to take that away from her. There's no justification whatsoever. She's done the work. She deserves the credit. And I don't think anyone can disagree with this. But like you were saying, that's not really what's been happening, is it? It's actually that the structures themselves are there's a concerted and deliberate attempt to remold the world to incentivize women to go into these fields. And like you said, it's sort of feminization of almost all of these institutions now that have a purpose, and they work in the way that they work because there is an internal goal to the institution. And actually the ideological framework that's being imposed on the institution actually presupposes the internal goal, but sets the actual agenda in a different direction. Now, this institution that was for science is actually really for producing equality. It's actually really for producing female professors or whatever it is. It's not really about what it's actually meant to be about. And I think that's the kind of danger with the path that the path that we've ended up at. And the problem is the ideological language of liberalism.
He's absolutely correct about this.
Was used to facilitate that, because these individual sort of keywords are picked out and used as the bludgeon against well-meaning people who were not thinking in these terms. They were the people who were like, obviously want a free and equal meritocracy. Why would I ever say no to that? But actually, there's a lot in there that's more destructive than you would think, and we're living in the ruins of that now. And there are other ways to look at this. As in, we have a habit of essentially reducing a person's life to the now. And we reduce this life to the now and say, okay, what's happening in this moment? Which is useful when you're making a day-to-day decision. But for most people, actually, it's more useful for them to have a long-term plan. And our entire civilization is geared against this. Do not plan for the future. Do not save money. Do not worry about the student debt you may have incurred. Do not worry about any of these things. Worry about where you are now. And that's actually very short-sighted. And one of the things that I think we are seeing as a recurring pattern now is millennial women who are growing older, and they're being told by their bodies, by the way, you should have a baby. And lots of them are feeling, oh yeah, no, you're right, I should have a baby. Why can't I find a man? The time is running out. I can't find a man. I'm not prepared to marry down. I'm not prepared to settle. I'm not prepared to give up my job, my career, which is a very impressive job and career because I was the beneficiary of the way that the world was restructured. What do I do? And I think in the next 10 to 15 years, we're going to see a kind of trend of very unhappy millennial women who are very bitter about the fact that they didn't get everything they thought they were going to get. And you'll probably see TikToks of them saying, why am I doing this? Why am I a scientist? Why am I a CEO? Why am I here? And this loss of purpose and meaning will...
He's cooking right now. I'm not going to lie. Sargon is cooking right now. He's cooking right now.
Be kind of devastating. I think it's genuinely going to be quite devastating to a lot of people. And so I think... because we have essentially disconnected people from what I guess could be called the narrative of a human life into these categories of I am a scientist, I am a mother, I am a race car driver, whatever. Like you're taking these things out of the natural flow and ebb of what a human life is. Begins and it grows, and then eventually it comes to a conclusion. It's a story. Everything really about a human life is a story. And I think a lot of people are going to get the endings that they don't want.
Oh, I think you're exactly right about this. And this is a huge and very difficult topic to navigate. But I would say overwhelmingly, and this didn't start with the millennials, but overwhelmingly the story of civilization and this kind of broken sort of liberalism that has taken over has lured multiple generations now into massive self-harm, right? Things have been championed that when you actually do them result in the life that you might have led being degraded. And this is creating a lot of bitterness. Now, this is a difficult one for me. I don't like saying this at all, but nonetheless, it's ever clearer to me. I see signs of life amongst young men. I see them beginning to recognize what they lost and trying to find their way back. I'm not sure back is where they want to go, but trying to find their way back because it was better. And I do not see this amongst young women. I see a lot of doubling down on these notions that turn out to have been devastating. And there's a sense that those notions are entitled to be right, that these ideas are so beautiful that surely if we just put our foot on the accelerator. Sooner or later, we will get to that utopian place. And I'm frustrated that women are not recognizing the predicament that has been created. I'm not looking for fault finding. What I want is for people to stand up for themselves. And to the extent that they've been sold a bill of goods that has led them into self-harm, I would like them to reject it, return to sender, and figure out what I suspect are not going to be old rules. They're going to have some traditional aspects to them. They're going to have some novel aspects to them, but to essentially renegotiate.
Basically, yeah, renegotiate. Like, this is the thing. Everybody operates in this, like, zero-sum, it's like everybody has such a zero-sum, binary way of looking at the situation that we find ourselves in between radical feminism and traditionalism. There seems to be this belief that it's either the 1950s or every woman has 2 baby daddies, right? And that's just like that's not what people are suggesting. People are mostly reasonable. And this is something that people on the internet forget because they spend so much time on Twitter, as I've said already, and I said this earlier. Most people are reasonable. Most people are amicable. And this idea that, like, you're going to have every man wanting to, let's repeal the 19th, let's put women back in kitchens. That's not what's being proposed. What's being proposed is a modification to the status quo, a renegotiation, as Brett just said, of the sexual contract between men and women. Because between the divorce courts and the sexual revolution and OnlyFans and the cost of living, this cannot continue. And if anybody had a grain of common sense, people would think to themselves, hey, let's slow down a bit here, and, you know, because we're kind of on a collision course, and let's renegotiate and plan, where do we want our society to be in 10 years? What do we want our society to look like when we have children? That's what smart and prudent people are thinking about right now.
The agreement between the sexes, in light of the fact that, you know, the notions that followed from the sexual revolution turned out to be a disaster.
I think you're exactly right. And I like the framing you've got here, because there's time only works in one direction. It only flows forward. And the world is so markedly different now. I think you're absolutely right. I think it will be essentially a renegotiation that happens, you know, between millions of young men and young women as they try and work out what actually they want from one another. And I really take your point as well, that the vitality of our civilization is currently with those young right-wing Zoomers who are angry. Like they are on a crusade, and they've finally found purpose in the crusade. Everyone else, exactly as you say, I don't see any vitality in them. I see essentially a civilization that has basically given up and has decided, no, okay, we're just going to carry on drifting on as we do until we run out of petrol, and then we are just lost at sea or something. And it's these young men who are actually like, okay, no, we would like things to be different in a way that we think would be more wholesome. Now, like you say, for the Nick Fuentes crowd, like I said, I don't dislike them, but then they're not the world's greatest diplomats for this way of looking at the world. But I think we just have to accept that this is the hand that's been dealt. They've not been well served. They're not self-authoring. They didn't come out of nothing. They didn't will themselves into existence or anything. They are what we've made of them. And they are wielding the only weapons that they have, but they're wielding them effectively. I mean, they've commanded the discourse, which is why Nick Fuentes ended up on Piers Morgan's show, which is why everyone has been talking about it ever since. There's a reason that this is happening, and the young men stand to gain something. Like, they actually realize there's something we can gain out of this. And I think really, if they knew how to properly communicate it, I think what they're asking for is they want a position of honor and dignity in society. I really think that's what they're asking for.
That's
I think
fair.
they do want to be.
That's
I think
fair.
they look back on like the sort of 50s housewife and husband with envy and say, no, I would like to be a provider for my wife and family. I think that's what honestly most of them are just asking for, which is not unreasonable, actually. They're not asking for palaces. They're not asking for a kingdom. They're asking for a house and a home and a wife and children and a job that they can pay, they can work at and pay the bills with. And this is all really reasonable. And so it's a crusade with a goal that actually is in sight. It's possible to attain. And within living memory, people have had it. So you can't tell them that this isn't this is ridiculous, or it's not lunacy for them to ask for the dignity of essentially the fathers and the men and the fathers in society to be returned. And how can you fault it?
Oh, I don't. I think what I hear in your portrayal is there is a desire to come in from the cold, right? These people literally were born into a world demonizing them for things they had nothing to do with. And that feels terrible. It's also a strategic mistake on behalf of those who usurped this power, in the sense that they've given the Zoomers ever less to lose, right? Yes. What they've got is a crappy deal. And so civilization, the older generations, are more or less naively depending on them to remain well-behaved, getting scraps from the table. And here's a novel thought, though. I'm sure they're not thinking of it this way. I don't think this is conscious, but I wonder if the stuff that rightly spooks people like you and me, the rhetoric about, lionizing genocidal dictators, for example, is really part and parcel of a negotiation. If they are actually wielding a credible threat to return the world to absolute madness, if they are not given a reasonable deal. And, I don't like the style of it one bit, because those tropes are so dangerous, and the things that they threaten to call forth are so deeply ingrained in humans. However, I don't disagree that they have a right to threaten to walk out on a civilization that has betrayed them in this way. I think that's, if I were in their shoes, I would feel that too.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right on that. And what's interesting is the negotiation that they're having with us over this, right? Because all their lives they've been told, as straight white men, that they are not allowed to be proud of being straight white men, nor are they allowed to have a kind of collective sense of being straight white men. There's nothing noble about being a straight white man, especially a young one. Now, in all of the periods of history, this is just the opposite of how things are, actually. Go back as far back in history as you like, and the young straight white men are the heroes of every story. Every single story. And they are the ones who take the burden and the dangers on their own shoulders. They go through hell, many of them die, but at the end they get the reward of whatever they're being promised, and they earn it. And we are saying to them, there is no way for you to fulfill this telos. There's nothing there for you. What you will be is a low testosterone beta male, and maybe one day a woman will take pity on you and marry you, maybe probably won't have children with you, and you'll be generally poorly thought of by everyone around you. And okay, that's not a very appealing offer. And then if in the next breath they say, right, but don't you like Adolf Hitler? Because Adolf Hitler wanted exactly what you wanted. And he was powerful. He was rhetorically impressive. Say whatever you like, but the Nazis knew what they were doing when they hired Hugo Boss to do their uniforms. Right? They understood the importance of aesthetics. They understood the importance of presence. They understood the importance of looking the part. And so honestly, you've essentially created a kind of perfect villain for these Zoomer men to say, no, listen, right? If you don't allow us in the traditional English-speaking mold to be heroic, because we've got plenty of English-speaking heroes who embody masculine glory. We've got just a huge, long history of it. And they'll say, fine, we'll take the villain who embodies masculine glory, and we will be unapologetic about that. And that, I think, when Nick Fuentes says Hitler was cool, well, yeah, that's how he became the leader of Germany. He was cool. He was bold. He was a war hero. He dressed snappily. All of the soldiers marching by, goose-stepping. I'm not for it, but I can see why it was impressive to people, right? And it's the same with any kind of mass organization like that, where you've got a camaraderie and you've got confidence that is being denied in our own civilization. And then you say, look, you see these really macho, really confident, really stylish looking guys? They're the bad guy. You're not allowed to like them because we don't like them. It's like, well, they hate you for holding them down. Of course, you've just put a target on, if you want to fight us, well, you guys, you like that guy over there. And that means that we react in all kinds of ways. Because, at the moment, like Chuck Schumer was denouncing him in the Senate or something, wasn't he? Mm-hmm. And you've got Piers Morgan and everyone's saying, it's like, Nick Fuentes is a 27-year-old. Can he even grow a beard? Like, does he even need to shave his face? Like, he has a microphone and a podcast and a bunch of other young men who aren't really much of a physical threat to anything. Like, I don't genuinely think they're going to overthrow society or lead a coup on the government or anything. Like, I've never seen one that looks impressive to me as a man, as a father, as an adult. And yet they're being treated on the ideological level as a mortal peril to the current regime. And it's like, okay, well, I mean, if that were my son, I'd be like, just go to your room. I'd just tell them off. I'd just go to your room. I'm sick of this now. But they can't. They feel they can't do that, and so they've put themselves essentially in a bind where they've given him the way of attacking them, and they've legitimized the power in doing so. They've said, no, we will essentially imbue you with power by reacting to this thing. So of course they're just.
This is the problem with what Sargon is saying. So what Sargon is basically saying is that the hysteria about Nick Fuentes is unnecessary, and there's a lot of truth in that. But once again, that's because he's looking at him through the lens of a regular, everyday political live streamer, and you have to look at him for what he represents, and you have to look at him as a genuine, legitimate political figure, and what direction his ideas will move this country in. That is how you have to unpack his message. That is how you have to analyze Nick Fuentes, because if not, of course, it's going to look like everybody's hysterical. And he kind of uses this to his advantage when he says, oh, I'm just a political live streamer. It's like, well, yeah, but you're also a major political figure. You also have over 1 million followers on Twitter. You have articles and you have articles about you in the New York Times and WAPO. People are talking about you on Fox News. I mean, the guy is obviously a major political force, unquestionably. And we need to reckon with that. And if it's not him, fine, we can disregard Fuentes, but we need to understand his ideas, his movement, why it's so appealing. And if you don't actually wrestle with those things, then the outgrowth of his ideas could be a serious problem. It could be very potentially radicalizing. I think Sargon is downplaying it too much, but then again, I don't know what Sargon believes.
And for them, this is hilarious as well. You can see how much fun they're having with it. And to be honest with you, it's kind of funny. I hate to say it. And I agree with you completely about the reality of what happened in World War II. Horrific. Absolutely. On every side, frankly. Wherever you go. I mean, I remember in school despising history. And it was only as an adult that I genuinely nurtured a love of history. Because in school, it was World War I and World War II. That was excessively focused on. And it was dreary. It was horrific. It was just dead people, terrible poems, mass graves, and industrial killing. And it was like, oh my God, that is awful. But if that was even further out of time for me at least, I was like, God, I'm glad that's all over. That ended a long time before I was in school. And now we're like 30 years on with Nick Fuentes from that. Well, the question is kind of like, when does the Nazi regime pass into history? It's just a historic event. And I guess we're finding out now it's about 85 years or so, right? That seems to be, the living memory essentially is kind of worn off at this point. And so to the Zoomers now, this is just something, it might have happened 1,000 years ago, as far as they're concerned.
And I like as much as I fear that it will be clipped in order to make you look like a crazy person, I like your point about the things that are obviously true that you can't say about Hitler, that these Zoomers are now realizing, oh, you can say them. Obviously, he inspired a nation. That wasn't by accident. There was an awful lot there that allowed that to happen. And if you think about it, back in 2017 or 2018, I put out a piece in which I said, basically, you people are making a terrible mistake demonizing straight white men, because what you're going to do is back them against the wall together, and you're going to create exactly the thing that you're accusing them of that they're not guilty of. And if I think back to the history since 2015, and I think about the images of, statues of George Washington and Thomas Jefferson being torn down.
Yeah.
The point is, okay, you all managed civilization in such a way that we demonized the flawed but heroic characters that gave us our world. And now people are finding other characters who, in some sense, you didn't bother to degrade because they were off limits. What did you expect to happen?
That's such a great point. The tearing down of the statues of people like George Washington. I mean, from an American perspective, how much more iconic a masculine hero could you get than George Washington? I've actually just finished reading a book about George Washington.
Yeah, that's true.
And in his own day, just considered an incredibly noble man. I mean, it's likely that the presidency only exists because of the character of George Washington.
We would not have this nation without George Washington. Irrespective of how you feel about the guy, he created the most glorious nation in the history of mankind. And you have to look at him from a historical perspective. I mean, what's more legendary than that? What's more iconic than that? That's somebody that we can all be proud of as Americans. So, no, the whole we're going to do iconicalism against our own nation, I've always despised that shit.
Washington, and everyone knew that he would move in to fulfill it, and everyone, obviously, as the blueprint of the ideal president. And so, if you deny young men that man as a hero, well, you can't tear down statues of a man you never put statues up to. You know,
right?
You can't do that. There's nothing to despoil with Adolf Hitler. He is the secular Satan, and if they have decided that your regime, your entire order, is itself evil, well, then it's easy to invert into thinking, well, maybe that guy was good, actually. And that's how we've arrived here.
Especially in light of the jaw-dropping level of lying that has overtaken our official sanctioned narrative of civilization. So, you create a completely fictional universe, and you try to feed it to people, and when they don't take it, you threaten them and coerce them. And what you're doing is inviting them to go find villains in history, because the alternative is, it's trompe l'oeil utopian nonsense. So I don't know, I can almost...
Just as a quick side there as well. Yeah, you're absolutely right. If they're going to tell lies about the genuinely sort of wholesome heroes that we actually have in the West, well, everything they've heard about anything has been a lie. Well, what have they been told about Adolf Hitler? What have they been told about the Nazis? Why would they not assume you're lying about that too? If we can't even have our heroes, and they definitely don't need to have those villains, we've reduced them all to the same plane now. They're all the same. They're all evil, oppressive, straight white men. You're not drawing a moral distinction between Nelson and the Nazis. You're not drawing distinctions like that anymore. And so it becomes very easy to say, well, then they're all basically the same. I'm going to choose the one that you're most offended by. I'm going to choose the one with the coolest drip. I'm going to choose the one who most unapologetically spoke in terms that actually everyone around me is speaking in, just for their own races, for their own ethnicities, for their own groups. I'm going to choose the one who speaks like that for us. And so you end up with the Hitler fan club on Twitter making Piers Morgan look like an idiot. And it's like, God, and like you say, we everyone in the sort of dissident spaces online was saying, look, man, this is going to come about whether you like it or not, because you're giving it no outlet, giving it nowhere to go. And what do you expect these people to do?
Well, it actually beautifully makes your point from earlier, where you were talking about your hesitancy about meritocracy. Because on the one hand, it's obviously, meritocracy in any meaningful sense is it's the best way to run civilization, because it puts the best people doing all the jobs, and civilization benefits from it. But your point is, hey, not so fast.
Yeah, but that's the thing, though. Like, not everybody agrees with that fundamental idea. That's a huge problem. That is a major problem with Nick Fuentes' ideology. It's not, we want the best people running the show. It's, we believe that people's race and ethnicity and religion we believe that people's race, ethnicity, and religion inform their decision making in such a way that we can only have people in positions of power if their identity conforms, or if their identity corresponds with the one that we want in charge of society, and they have the skills and levels of competence necessary to advance society. So it's not enough to just say people have the skills and it's not enough to just say people have the skills and the aptitudes necessary to lead society or to run a civilization. They have to also have the identity of the kinds of people that we want in charge. That's a major problem that Brett doesn't seem to have resolved here. They think that it's indispensable for somebody to be white and Christian whilst also being intelligent and knowledgeable. You need all of those components in order to be a sufficient leader. So they don't believe in true meritocracy. They believe in meritocracy for the people of their identity or meritocracy for the people of their race. That's a problem.
Because you'd never believe what people will, smuggle in under that banner. And is it not true that we can look at what these maniacs have done to history as a test of what they think merit looks like, right? If you're tearing down statues of George Washington, then you're telling us something about your idea of merit. I'm not saying George Washington wasn't flawed, but I agree with your analysis 100%. This was a noble, insightful, admirable, attractive guy who, frankly, obviously this was a slaveholder. On the other hand, this was somebody who understood slavery was wrong. This is somebody who I was shocked to discover. I didn't know that there were any Jews in the colonies. This is somebody who defended them, right? This is a person with a human with excellent character, and we're tearing down statues claiming that he was, somehow undignified, beneath contempt, whatever it is that we're pretending. You're telling us that when you say merit, you mean something totally different. And I think the Zoomers are, or at least the ones who are paying attention to Nick Fuentes, they aren't in a position to take over civilization by force. But because of the way Western civilization works, they are in a position to upend it. Right? We're talking about a generation that can vote the political order out of existence and replace it with something else. And you can hear the tropes they're playing with. That's a pretty frightening thing to imagine. So at some level, I think this is nature's wake-up call, right? If you don't like the rhetoric of Nick Fuentes, then you better figure out why it is that it's resonating, because that's coming for you whether you like it or not.
That's
also,
true.
If you think
that's why it's good that Brett is an evolutionary psychologist, because he understands the human psychology behind why Nick Fuentes' movement is so, and the evolutionary psychology behind why Nick Fuentes' movement is so appealing. That's the thing. Like, once people begin to buy into this idea that there is no, not even political solution, but that there is no resolution or solution that is attainable in regards to achieving harmony in the society other than complete and utter power arrested by a particular racial group. Once people embrace that mindset, we really will have a serious problem on our hands. Like a serious problem on our hands. We're talking about like potentially balkanizing the country. And thank God we have somebody like Brett who's wise enough to understand that. That's why we have to like really chill with the world is over, existential, they want all of you dead. No, that's not actually right. That's not actually right. That's not true. That's not representative of the average American by a long shot. But people, for whatever reason, think it is because they spend so much time on the internet. But that's actually not accurate. So thank God we have people like Brett. But the whole existential, they're going to genocide you, kill you tomorrow, they want to kill your children, all that kind of stuff. People wonder why, political violence is becoming more common now. It's because of shit like that. It's because people think that that saying those sorts of things doesn't have any kinds of consequences, and that's just not true.
The rhetoric of Nick Fuentes is bad. How bad do you think the guy who comes after Nick Fuentes is going to be? Because Nick Fuentes, for all his flaws, he does moderate himself when he's actually cornered on these things. It's very easy to say, well, yeah, and I actually believe quite a lot when he says, well, when I'm on my live stream and I'm riffing to my audience and I'm doing this for a couple of hours and it's just me talking, I'll say things that are bombastic and over exaggerated that I don't really mean because it's funny and it's transgressive and it entertains the audience. I am a political entertainer. I actually do think there's quite lots of that, because whenever he has a proper sit down serious conversation with people, he usually does actually moderate himself a lot more. And I think that if you were to in the abstract ask him just write down the things you truly believe, I suspect that's a lot closer to what he actually would truly write down there. It's just in the relational perspective of I'm being attacked by Piers Morgan, or I have a bunch of radical feminists who are going at me. I'm gonna channel the spirit of Hitler just to fight back against the kind of psychic war I'm in. I don't think that's. I don't think he's an unmitigated evil, right? I think that he's radical, but I think that he's not just an evil Nazi. right? But I think the guys who come after, who realize that they'll see Nick Fuentes now, they're probably going to be 14, 15 years old now, watching Nick Fuentes, having a reasonable conversation with Tucker Carlson, trying to have what he thinks is a reasonable conversation with Piers Morgan, and seeing all the gotchas, and seeing them, snipping at him, and seeing the clips, and seeing the media attacks. Be like, right, okay, look, even when he's trying to moderate, and he's saying, I agree with, I went too far there, or, maybe we could just ask for a bit of consideration here or there. And they didn't get it. They got demonized as the worst things in the world, and the collective zeitgeist of the mainstream sort of system was just stamp these down as far as we can. We will stamp these down as much as we can. So don't expect any mercy. Don't expect any quarter. When they've finally taken Nick Fuentes off the internet, and the next guy comes up, and he's even more radical. And he's like, no, guys, this isn't even a joke anymore, right? This isn't me memeing. We're on now, right? This is on now. We're gonna. I don't know what they're gonna do. God only knows. And it gets to the point where you were saying, it's like, look, there is genuinely dark forces that could be unleashed from all of this. And so to save ourselves from unleashing it, what would be very sensible is if men of our age were actually to make the more civilized demand on behalf of these young men and say, actually, they deserve a place of honor in our civilization.
Yeah.
Right? That's what they're asking for. And that's what avoids all of this.
That's a totally fair request. I think that's totally fair and understandable. That is totally fair and understandable. And I think that's right. People want to have honor in their civilization, in their ancestors, in their culture. And I think if that's the request, that's totally fair and understandable. I have no issue with that. And I think that's a kind of collaborative approach that will sort of calm things down and improve, I think, race relations in this country, because that's obviously what I'm after. I'm not after like displacing or dispossessing anybody or white people. No, I want cooperation and unity. I think that's a positive goal to pursue. The only thing is, I just don't want one group to repress everybody else because of racial differences. I think that's horrible. But if the request is respect, acknowledgement, honor, I think that's totally fair. I want that for them. So that's good.
All of this goes away if we just recognize that young men do deserve a place of honor in our civilization. And I don't know, I'm not saying I have a prescription for that. I'm not saying that other people who aren't straight white men can't have anything or anything like that. I'm not saying any of those things. I'm just saying there should be something that they can call their own if there are things that everyone else gets to call their own.
Yes,
and
exactly.
Without that recognition, resentment will continue to build.
The level playing field requires it, right? If you actually believe in a level playing field, then you have to understand if you're going to enable everybody else's racism, then you got to put up with it in these people too. I don't care that you don't like their color, right? If racism is off the table, it's off the table for everybody. If it's on the table, then so be it. But you can't tie their hands behind their backs. They didn't do this. This is not their responsibility. Now, the question is, people like you and me have a metaphorical gun to our heads. If we do what you just said, which frankly I think is the only rational thing. If you are interested in preserving Western civilization and you don't want this to be, well, let's see what the guy after Nick Fuentes sounds like, then the right thing to do is to recognize the legitimacy of the grievance that these people have, to recognize that it can be harnessed for good or evil, and that the right thing to do is to recognize the legitimacy of their claim and to figure out how to produce a world that does welcome them. If you don't do that, then they're in charge of what happens next. And when we say something along those lines, you and I will become demons in the eyes of the mainstream. And
that is possible. But like we said at the beginning, I honestly feel like I have an obligation to tell what I think is the truth. I've got two sons as well. I've got two daughters too. And for all of their good, it strikes me that living in a world that is artificially unbalanced is not good, especially one that seems to be sitting on a time bomb. Not only am I worried for the actual, the futures of my actual children, but there's a part of me that thinks, well, I'm quite successful. Maybe I can insulate them from the excesses of the world or something like that. My kids will be fine. Okay, maybe if my kids are fine, that's fine. But what about everyone else's children? Most people aren't in the same position as I am, and we're not solving any of the problems. And so I honestly feel compelled to say, well, as unpopular as it might make me, I think if we have to look at the world that we're in as a kind of joined up whole. Right, we've got this habit of trying to atomize everything and try and compartmentalize things and break them down and say, right, okay, well, we've sorted this part out. We can just ignore this part because that part is racist or whatever. And it's like, okay, you can say that, but like the whole thing is a real connected whole. Everything is connected to everything else in every conceivable manner. And there's no escaping it. We all live in it together. And actually, it would be better if we actually give each other regard. And like you saw this from social justice activism. We want to feel seen. We want representation. So yeah, because regard, recognition is really the kind of core that drives all political action, right? It's like someone saying, well, no, I deserve something because of whatever reason, because I am that I am. And it's like, okay, well, that's fine. And I'm happy to actually concede on some of those points, right? That are being made from the left or that have been made from whatever group. Yeah, I agree that you should be entitled to something that is yours. But the question is, how much is yours? And the question is, at whose expense? And how much do they have to give to you at their expense? And what do you give in return? Because actually, every relationship is reciprocal. So what are you going to do? What are you going to give? And suddenly, I think when you point out that the relationship has to be reciprocal, a lot of demands just stop, actually. A lot of people stop making demands. They realize, oh, I don't make a sacrifice, actually. The way that things were naturally, I was quite happy with, actually. I don't want to make a specific sacrifice. I thought I was getting something for free. And when you take the freebie off the table, you realize that people are not quite as hardline as they seemed. Does that make sense?
Oh, 100%. A lot of this
That's
has
true.
to do with the racket that has taken over civilization. And basically, lots of people are being drained of well-being that is flowing to somebody else, and they are kept in line with propaganda and threats. And that process, if you don't have self-respect, maybe you just put up with it because you can't see an alternative. But it's galling, and it eventually, you can stave off the disaster by ratcheting up the threats, but it's a worse disaster that's coming when you do that. And, to your point about insulating your own kids, I just don't see how you can. I'm looking at the world that my kids are maturing into, and frankly, Heather and I are both concerned about how you find a mate who is up to the challenge in this day and age. That's a big stumbling block that is the result of lots of stupid dynamics that have been sold as if they were sophisticated. But even if you could, as you point out, we have an obligation not only to other people's children, and I feel that obligation profoundly, but to civilization itself. We have something that functions. It actually has beaten every alternative with respect to actually producing human dignity and the liberation of people to discover what's worthy of them. It has been far from perfect, obviously. But the fact that we have a prototype of something, the West, and that thing is simply better than the chaos that exists under any other regime means we have an obligation to preserve that, not only for other people's kids who, we can conceptualize, but just so that there is a future. It's very easy to fall back into the patterns that made history into like a never-ending series of abattoirs. And if we've got something that's an alternative to that, we are obligated to protect it.
Exactly.
I think it's
finally somebody who gets it.
It's legs at this point. We've done so much. We've borrowed, to use your phrase from your piece, we've mortgaged their future, and we had no right to do it. That was a nasty trick we pulled on them. Now I'm using the term we, even though I wouldn't have done it, but
we collectively. But I mean, I completely agree with you. Like, one of the things that compels me to do the job that I do, because I mean, I could make videos about anything I wanted. Right? I can make videos about movie analysis or philosophical breakdowns or something like that. But I feel compelled to talk about these hard political issues because, frankly, I just don't see someone else doing the job I want to see done. Because I don't want my children coming of age in 10 years time or whatever and then saying, well, why did you just let the world go like this, Dad? And at least I'll be able to point at my body of work and say, well, look, son, I did my best. I'm sorry that the world is as it is. It didn't used to be when I was a boy, and I did my best to spread awareness and make people think actually it could be a different way. So at least they can be angry, but at least they won't be angry that I did nothing and just coasted on the good fortune that we had. But I'd like to talk about the way that you're characterizing Western civilization there, because it's correct, but I think it's incomplete, right? So I think you're absolutely right because what I think you're describing is a kind of rational, instrumental level, as in what Western civilization is good for, and that's obviously correct, which is why everyone's trying to move here, right? It's obviously we have the correct political settlement in the way that we deal with our political life, and
that's true.
It's been hard fought for the last 1,000 years. Actually, it's been a really, really tough slog. From the Anglo-Saxons against the Normans to the people against the king and Parliament against the king to the American revolutionaries against the king to what we have now. And it's been a long, difficult road, but I think you can characterize it as upwards. And I think the fact that, everyone materially is doing better than in previous eras. Even though things are getting worse now, we're still relatively comfortable, which is why, because I mean, people don't understand just how much rioting and how many revolts happened in history. Revolts happened all the time over what seemed to be trivial things to us. I mean, look at, what was it, 2% stamp tax or something that caused the American Revolution, right? Like that, to us, I mean, I get taxed an unbelievable amount, and I'm still not revolting. So we have a genuine luxury and privilege in the position we're in, and so you're obviously correct about the technique of Western civilization, but there is more than that I think is what the Zoomers feel that they've had kind of like burned away. And I think that this is the thing that is the soulful aspect of these things that I think will be captured in 100 years' time when future philosophers read the books from 100 years before us and realize that these people lived in a world that was much more sentimental and far less rules oriented and far less rational, but more loving for it. Because I think I did a video about this a while ago. I think really what people are looking for is just a place that they can feel like they belong. I think this is what nostalgia is about. I think the reason that everyone feels this longing for a home that no longer exists, I mean, you can't go back to when you were a child, but you knew where you were, you knew where you belonged, and you knew that tomorrow would be like today, and everything would be predictable and reliable, and you had people around you who you knew loved you. And that, I think, is really what everyone actually wants. And I think that's what every parent is trying to create for their children. I think that's what all of the stuff that, we as parents, you get up every day and you do a lot of jobs you don't want to do. You change bums, you make breakfast at like 6 in the morning, you're tired, you go to work. What you're doing, you do that for your children because you know that they're going to have that longing for home. You know that they're going to love the world that they live in. And they'll genuinely have a deep and abiding love for their own civilization. And it won't be about rules, it won't be about rationality, it will be in the heart. And what I worry about is that this excessive rationalization of our world actually severs that connection. And this is one of the things that really bothers me about the transgender children thing. Now, of course, every aspect of it is really bad, but it's what they do is they stigmatize the wholesome aspect of being a child by introducing this rational element. It's do you think that you're a girl? Do you think that you're a boy? It's like, well, hang on a second. You don't understand what you're doing there, right? You're destroying the possibility of future nostalgia. Right? That's what you're doing there. You're destroying the possibility of an abiding love of their own innocence in childhood. And this is what's so devastatingly bad about the destruction of innocence, is that you sever these people from the kind of psychic connection they had to their own past and make it.
That's the thing. Like, that's the thing with communists. That's the thing with Marxists. It's like they want everybody to have a class conscious, to be ideologically uniform, to be atheistic, to be uncommitted to any nation, uncommitted to any tribe. But what people don't understand is these primordial elements of the human condition define identities. And life is difficult, and life is confusing. And identity gives you something to anchor yourself in that helps you withstand and navigate the suffering and difficulty of life, which is why primordial identities can be so important and powerful for people. And this is something that Marxists don't understand. And this is exactly why the moment the Soviet Union disbanded, everything went to shit. Because you had Georgians, Ukrainians, you had all kinds of people living inside the Soviet Union, all kinds of nations. And imagine communities and groups of people with a shared identity and culture and race and religion and what have you, literally give people purpose and meaning in ways that an ideologically vapid commitment to a class revolution simply can't. Just see yourself as a worker that's ideologically uniform, fighting against capitalism and the working class. I get it. Because all these other things are kind of peripheral in regards to your primary concern, which is liberating the working class. And race and religion and all these sorts of things kind of dilute one's ability to focus solely on class consciousness in a class revolution. But what they don't understand is that is not enough to bond people together long term. You cannot hold people together long term on the basis of an ideology. It does not work. You need something more primordial, more what's the word? Spiritual than that, literally. And so what he's saying is absolutely true. Love of nation, love of civilization. This is why I love this country. When I see the flag, when I see the American flag, I do feel like, hey, this is my birthright. This is my nation. This is my home. And I don't want to see it just torn down. I don't want to see it just destroyed, because capitalism and oligarchy is bad. But capitalists would have you believe, or communists would have you believe something entirely different. But they don't understand. That's what they don't get.
So they can never love.
It's deeper than the class revolution.
In the way that people who didn't have that severed can love. And they never talk about it in these terms. And so they rationalize about, but what about it'll reduce the suicide rate or something. That's like, okay, well, I'm not even sure I believe you on that, but there are other things that you're doing that are terrible. And I can't give you a chart. I can't enumerate them. There's no measuring this, but it's real. And I think it's honestly what we should be gearing our civilization towards. Because, I heard a story the other day. My wife went to Japan with my oldest daughter, and they came back. And basically, there was this one story. They didn't tell it, but they gave me stories that reminded me of this story of some 3-year-old kid who gets on the train or on the bus and goes to school or their preschool or whatever it is on their own. And you just think, how many things had to happen to make that possible? How many different people in their lives they had to feel that deep sense of place and belonging and love, so that it's safe for a 3-year-old to be able to navigate a city on their own. And this is one of those things where I think that we don't understand what school shootings are. School shootings and just random mass shootings generally are an attack on society itself. They're not, if you had a problem with a particular kid at school, you go and target that kid at school. But when it's just randomly targeting, what that is saying, I feel like I don't belong here. I feel like the connection I'm supposed to have with this place has been severed, and I'll never get it. And I'm angry about this. I'm vengeful about this. You've wounded me, and I want to hurt you in return. And so I like I said, I don't even know what to do with this series of thoughts I have, but I can't shake them out of my mind.
Well, I think you're onto something really important. There is, to the extent that what I'm calling the West has a fatal flaw, it is that I believe the West rightly seeks to liberate the individual, but that it doesn't necessarily know philosophically why it's doing that and what the risks of it are. And the situation you're describing in Japan involves a love for your fellow man that is manifest as a love of the structures that you share that enable you to let your 3-year-old get on a bus and think that's a reasonable thing to do. The world that, I don't know how old you are. How old are you?
46.
46. All right, I'm 56. The world I grew up in was a lot closer to that. I certainly rode my bike to school, disappeared, and tried to be home for dinner, that kind of thing. It was safer because it was collectively built to be safer. Yeah. And we've gotten away from this as we've become obsessed with our own individual rights, advantages, opportunities. And so anyway, ironically enough, this is what you find as the core political message in Nick Fuentes' take on civilization is America First, where, he's talking about something like this. And of course, the terminology America First is, it's fraught with historical baggage. So it's not obviously the right term, but the idea that we ought to be governing for our collective well-being is not wrong at all. And you can tell in the way we allow our children to be.
Yeah, that's one of the faults with liberalism, is that it treats the most important unit of the human species as the individual. And when we're talking about the relationship between the man and the state, that's probably a good way of organizing your society. But when we're talking about the culture and the unity of a nation, it's actually not a good idea to drastically embrace radical individualism as the standard for your nation's culture and identity. I actually don't think that's wise. There has to be things gluing people together culturally, nationally, outside of the context of the relationship between the man and the state. And that's one of the major shortcomings and flaws with liberalism, which is why I call myself a liberal, lowercase l liberal or classical liberal. But when we're talking about culture and nations, that requires a different lens of analysis that liberalism simply cannot explain, or that liberalism is not sufficient for understanding. And this is why I call myself a nationalist. And there's certain things with that term that might contradict some of my more liberal values. Like, for example, if I believe that the individual is the most important unit of the human species, or the most important unit within a nation, necessarily that would mean immigrants should be able to come here, if I'm logically consistent, and be able to express their own individual culture without having to conform to the nation's culture, because I believe in this liberal value, or I believe in liberal values. But like I said, I'm also a nationalist, and I believe that nations need to be unified and strong in order to survive. And for that reason, I also understand that it's not good for everybody to come here and for there to be so many subcultures, not any monoculture that holds everybody together. But obviously that contradicts with my liberal values. So this is why I don't pigeonhole myself to any particular ideology. And this is why it's important to always be in a constant state of changing and evolving, but also understand that there's limits to your particular ideology. And in our case, me and Brett, it would be kind of like a more classical form of liberalism.
Be parasitized by corporate interests or cajoled into embracing some ideological revolution over gender. This is us failing to protect our children from predators. It's unforgivable and couldn't be a bigger mistake with respect to keeping civilization running. You can't do that for many generations and expect to have anything but smoldering ashes left at the end, right? If you don't protect children from those who do not have their interests at heart, then your civilization isn't even defensible. Like at any level.
I remember, I think I was probably about 6 or 7 years old when I first started riding my bike to school on my own. And I think about that now and think there's no way I would do that. And I think the problem is, I guess, what we could call the kind of social contract society, where we have a society that's governed by a series of rules. And as long as everyone plays by the rules, then the society functions. But you get the kind of, what was the girl who was stabbed in the neck on the train the other day? Irina
Zarutska.
I know the case. I've forgotten her name.
Yeah. Well, that's a case of why the social contract society is actually not actually as good as you might want it to be, because the rules are only the rules and they work as long as the person is being rational and follows them. But this guy, just out of nowhere, stabs her in the neck and kills her. She couldn't have predicted this. You wouldn't have thought about this. How could you have possibly known this was going to happen? But you can feel that it's kind of always a possibility because you don't understand the people around you. You don't have any connection with them. You don't know anything about them. And you just assume, well, I'm going to follow the rules. They're not doing anything obvious now, so I assume they're going to follow the rules. And you end up with this genuinely just barbaric episode that really, it sticks in my mind because of just how out of place and time everyone is. Because I live in a village outside of a large town, but even the large town that I lived in the southwest of England, I'd walk through this town and I would, before we had mass immigration, I would walk through this town and I would bump into friends, co-workers, family members, and they just, they shout me and say, "Oh, Carl, how you doing, man? What are you doing on Fridays? Should we go out for a beer?" "Yeah, I'd love to, mate." And it gives this civilization a feeling of familiarity, of predictability. You know the people around you. Even if you don't know those people, someone you know will know that person. And so the web of connections that binds us all together lays heavily on the land, and it makes the place feel familiar and secure. Well, if you bring in millions of people who are from elsewhere, then essentially what you do is you attack that web of that psychic web that lays across the land. You break it up.
Yeah.
And so now you need the rules. Oh, okay, well, we're going to have a series of rules to at least allow this to function on a day.
Yeah, the excess dependency or reliance that we have on a rules-based order or on rules in the law ironically, that actually does more to break down social trust than anything else, because now you're not relying on good faith, and now you're not relying on goodwill or trust of your fellow man, but you're relying on them fearing the law more than caring about you to ensure your safety. And that's kind of one of the ironic things about having a society in which law is what's responsible for, what's the word? Protection. It's like not the culture, not sharing a religion, not being homogenous, not being ideologically or morally uniform or whatever. It's, I expect this person not to kill me or harm me or steal from me, because if they do, the state will get involved. That's actually not ideal. You don't want a society that functions that way. And this is what happens with empires like the United States. But, you know, in the case of Japan, it is a culturally and ethnically and religiously homogenous country. And that's one of the appeals of Japan, you know, which is true. And with Japan, you know, the culture and the shame around, you know, murder and rape and substance abuse and dishonor is so extreme that people would rather take their own lives than continue to live on in a state of shame and dishonor. And there's issues with that, obviously, when taken to its extreme. But I think as a baseline, there's something good about that, because it discourages people from violating the social contract. Because more than anything, more than just the consequences of the law or the consequences of the state, you will be shunned by your entire society. Your entire society will alienate you and ostracize you for violating the social contract. And I actually think that is more, I think that is a better inhibitor of antisocial behavior than the law could ever serve as, you know? So this is an interesting point that Sargon is bringing up here.
Day-to-day basis, let alone when one of them's like, I'm going to go mad. I mean, there was some guy from Africa who, at the local bus stop in the middle of Swindon, tried to kidnap a 17-year-old girl. And it's just like,
and that's the other thing. When the law is not consistently applied, and when the law fails to prosecute criminals or protect the public, that really erodes social trust. Because to begin with, you already don't have a society that's connected by a common culture or religion or a belief system. So that's already shot to begin with. But on top of that, you also have a society in which now the law is not enforcing the laws. Now even the law is not protecting the public. So trust is completely shot by that point, you know?
That's never happened. I've lived in Swindon for 27 years, 28 years. My family is from here. I've never heard of anything like that happening. And yet here we are with a stranger who has been planted in our civilization that we don't think in the way that needs to be thought about to protect ourselves from this. And obviously that girl on the train didn't either. And so it's like, okay, well, we're doing some serious damage to something that you think is intangible, but is, I think, what actually makes a place worth living in. Like this kind of nostalgic love of the place. And when all the people hold this, the place becomes the kind of place where a kid can ride their bike to school at 6 years old, and everyone knows it'll always be fine. Everyone around would help if there was a problem. Everyone around would. And it's just the fact that we're stealing this from our children is a really horrific thing. And I don't know what we can do to get it back.
Well, at the very least, we can recognize what did it. And, you know, I would say there are two major contributors. One, I would call it, and I'm definitely speaking from an American perspective here, but I would say there is a stinginess on the right, at least in the US, where there's a story about, you know, the titans of industry. And the answer is, well, they are the job creators. And they are. But that's not all they are, right? They're also the rent seekers. And so, you know, it may be that the story is complicated in each case, but the idea that somebody is sucking up so much of the well-being that it leaves people in greater austerity than they should have. That's one thing. The other thing that's contributing to it is the mind-numbing insanity of the utopian left, right? And so I don't think you're exactly right that everybody has to play by the rules for this to work, because there will never be a large civilization in which everybody plays by the rules. But the people who don't play by the rules have to quickly get found, and they have to get punished. And if they are not reformable, they have to be left locked up. And so, somebody can always have a screw loose and pull out a knife, and there's no way to stop that. But that person doesn't tend to have started there. And to the extent that that person finds themselves on the street because some, insane district attorney decided that they were incapable of committing a crime because they grew up in circumstances that would, of course, produce that effect, right? It's not that I don't understand that circumstances produce effects, but to have a civilization, people who break the rules, especially violently, have to come out way behind for it. That will reduce the problem a lot. And for the ones that are just simply unfixable, that's it. And, I remember the madness of defund the police, right? Defund the police is you telling us you would like to uninvent civilization. Because as soon as you take the police out of the equation so that somebody who is violent against others is going to get away with it, you are deciding on all of our future. So we didn't get here from nothing. We got here from some cruelty on one side and some, at best, insane delusion on the other. And the first thing to do is to recognize both of these things and correct them. I am all for people living very well when they create wealth for civilization. I think that's the right thing. We should reward them. They should live better than people who don't create any wealth. However, rent seeking degrades what the wealth creation creates. And we have to get serious about that problem. We're not going to fix it perfectly, but we can do vastly better than we're doing. We cannot allow people to be parasitized by their economic betters because they have no means of resistance. That's not acceptable. And we can't allow people to deploy their crazy utopian notions at scale and then not even take the data on how it worked out, because I think we now have a pretty good guess at how it works out. In your country, you're watching monsters protected by your government when they are acting in a predatory way towards little girls. Like, in what universe does anybody participate in any part of that system and sleep one wink at night, right? They should be racked with guilt every night. I don't care what level of the system you're in. If you're part of that, you're actually participating in predation on young girls. Like, what the heck?
Yes. I mean, you're exactly right. This is just a reckoning is coming on that particular subject. But I think that you're exactly right to frame this in terms that aren't traditionally liberal, actually, because of course the traditional liberals say, "Well, I'm for the free market." So, okay, but why are we for the free market? What do we hope to get out of the free market? And I think the answer would normally be property ownership, right? Because that's actually the good that we're aiming at. I personally own my own business. I own my house. I want everyone else to, if not own their own business, work at a business where the person who does own it is within reach, where they can walk into the next room and say, "Excuse me, boss, I've got a problem here," or something like that, right? I think that that's a much more healthy way for people to actually live, if not themselves, because not everyone wants to be a business owner, but being a big cog in a small machine is way better than being a small cog in a big machine. And so
Right.
Property ownership is, I think, the thing that we're actually aiming at for the good of life. People should own their own property. And so that's great. And the question is, well, how do we get there? Now, historically, free markets are a really good way of making that happen. And they were very, very productive, very, very successful. But I think we've arrived now at a point where, like you were saying, the sort of there is a potential for excessive rent seeking within the free market, and also other ways of deforming the free market. For example, I hate to keep bringing it back to immigration, but this is what genuinely the number one issue in Britain at the moment is just the sheer amount of immigration. And it's not that the immigrants are bad people. They're not, for the most part, they're absolutely not. It's just the nature of what is being done is very, very alien and mechanical, because it's the big businesses that want mass immigration.
That's the thing. It's mechanical. It's not organic. It's mechanical. Mechanically altering the natural, I guess, makeup of your society at scale. It's okay to do it in moderation, but at scale, obviously you're going to destabilize it, because the thing is, the state, here's the thing. The state is very mechanical. The nation is very organic. It's very real because it's made up of people. It's not just a system. And the state needs to understand that engaging in this kind of mechanical calculation about what will help the economy scale whilst simultaneously sacrificing what is best for the culture or the harmony of the nation, it's actually long-term not a trade-off worth making, because long-term it will backfire. And I think that, the state is very mechanical, and it forgets that you need to treat the nation as like a living, breathing thing almost. I don't know if that's weird terminology, but it's true. You need to always keep in mind the people that live within that nation already, and how all these kinds of manufactured and, technical changes that are done from a kind of remote perspective, the kinds of consequences that might have on your society if those consequences are not controlled for, prior to that decision being carried out. That's one of the major failures of neoliberalism, which is why I consider myself a nationalist, because neoliberalism does not at all, in any way, shape, or form, take into account the impact that its policies have on the nation, because it doesn't treat the nation as a real or living thing. And that's a major shortcoming and failure of not just neoliberalism, but also neoconservatism.
The most, because of course that's labor for them. That's cheap labor that depresses the wage that they have to pay those unskilled workers because of the vastly increased supply. And this has a series of knock-on effects. Well, of course, it raises the price of housing because these immigrants have to live somewhere. And so now what you've done, by using the free market, you've pushed property ownership out of the bounds of young people today. This is one of the reasons why the Fuentes crowd are so angry. That if they had their own businesses, their own houses to manage, their own little fiefdoms to manage in the world as normal, like I did, like my dad did, they would have no energy for political radicalism. But they don't have those things. And so, they spend a lot of time on the internet thinking, why don't I have these things? And so what the free market, the ideological sort of term the free market has done, has concealed the decreasing amount of property ownership in what the good that it was designed to set up to accomplish. Is actually concealed the fact that it's inhibiting it at this point.
I love this point that on the one hand, you're welcoming these people in to make cheap labor, and it is the externality is in the housing market. And of course, people are suffering from it egregiously. I would also point out, though, I think we dance around this immigration point because it's been booby-trapped. My feeling is this. I'm not pro-immigration. I'm not anti-immigration. What I want is for people who are not corrupt, who are well-informed about the issue, to figure out what the best level of immigration is and to set up a process that works. I don't want to see any illegals. I want to see people who come in legally. I want to see the number. Maybe it's a high number. Maybe it's a low number. I don't know. But I'd like to see the right number. I'd like us to at least aspire to it. And then most important of all, and I see this in both England and the US. Somewhere along the line, we apparently decided it was impolite to ask people who wished to come to our countries whether they liked us and aspired to be a part of our civilization. And my feeling is, whatever the number is that we should be allowing in.
That matters. This is the thing. Like, when people like fucking Vosh say, oh, the United States is so strong, and the fact that you think it'll be torn apart by a few people living here not liking the country, it's literally happening. It's literally happening. And when it happens at scale, it creates internal division and internal strife that literally seeps through your society and divides it and then destroys it. It's so fallacious, but of course he's a fucking Marxist. So of course he would say something like that. But not taking into account the way that unpatriotic, anti-American immigrants could affect your society, that just seems on its face stupid. Like, why would you ever neglect to account for something like that. That just seems so stupid in every conceivable way. In literally every conceivable way. You absolutely need to take into account the quality of the people you're bringing into your country and their beliefs and their culture. 100%. 100%, especially if you're bringing them in by the thousands. It's just common sense.
I don't want any who don't aspire to be American. I want people who like it, who want to make the place better and want to participate in it because they see it as good. We should not be letting people in who want to destroy it. Obviously, I can't imagine that anyone has to say that out loud, but apparently it has to be said out loud because it's not obvious to a lot of people. So,
which is crazy.
And the point is, is what I just said anti-immigrant? No, it's anti-people who hate us. And I have a right to be anti-people who hate us. It's obvious that I shouldn't
be defending, should it?
No,
you shouldn't have to defend that position.
It's common sense.
And what you said there is completely reasonable because, again, I really appreciate the way you framed that because very often the term pro-immigrant, anti-immigrant, again, itself turns into this instrumentalization of, okay, for what reason? And the answer is always the economy. It's like, well, okay, I appreciate the economy, but I'm not here to serve it, actually. And I'm not here to raise it above our civilization. It's a product of our civilization. And if our civilization is not thriving, then I'm not prepared to sacrifice the civilization to prop up the economy when instead we obviously need to come to some other dispensation about the way that life has to be led. I don't think our civilization should be about chasing numbers. It should be about living well. And I'll get in trouble for citing him, but Tucker Carlson made a great point about Japan. Japan's economy is not growing, but they have a lovely quality of life. They live well in their own civilization. And that's a good point. You don't have to be chasing endless growth unless you're someone who is interested only in the profit margin. And even then, okay, well, that's a good enough reason to not have my civilization in hock to that person, actually. I don't really want that person calling the shots. And so when it comes to who should we allow in, who shouldn't we allow in, who should come and live with us, who shouldn't come and live with us, well, we are actually at liberty to be a lot more discerning if we want to be. There's nothing wrong with that. And in fact, it's kind of strange that we have this just wildly open border policy, which most other countries just don't have. Like we've got a subscriber to Lotuses.com who is an English teacher in Thailand, and he regularly sends us updates from Thailand to let us know he's English. And it's just like how difficult it is to get citizenship there, and whether you'll ever actually get full citizenship or anything like that. You can work there, you pay, you can buy property, you can earn your money and pay taxes and stuff. But they have a very high bar to this, and they're entitled to have it if they want. Now, I'm not saying we need to have a high bar like that or anything like that, but to be discerning about the motives of the people is perfectly reasonable. And I think we should probably thank her for her service in this. But Ilhan Omar is throwing into sharp contrast a person and community whose motives are actually extractive, who are not, in fact, interested in becoming Americans, the well-being of America. Living in America permanently, it seems, actually, with the scale of the remittances back to Somalia or anything to judge by. Like, this is clearly an exploitative relationship that's happened because of America's open border policy. And there's no reason that should be tolerated. Same with the grooming gang situation in Britain. Sorry, I think the problem with there are lots of problems.
The whole problem with the Somalian thing is like it's a completely systemic failure. I think like the problem with conservatives and right wingers is it's lazy and it's shock jockey and it's provocative, and I'm guilty of doing this, so I'm not going to point the finger at anybody else. But the failure is, we look at all these Somalians. They're dark skinned. They look not. This is not an issue for me per se, but I'm just putting this in context. They're in Minnesota. They're dark skinned. They're African. They're Muslim. They're walking around with their hijabs. They look very different. They talk very different. Different language, different civilization, different culture, all the rest of it. And they huddle by the thousands into one area of one city. Cedar Riverside and, certain parts of Minneapolis by the thousands, 60,000, 70,000, 80,000. Well, I think it's 80,000 in the state. I think it's 30,000 in Minneapolis. But either way, they huddle in these small areas of the city by the thousands. They are completely different in all, in every relevant way. And there is a systemic failure to integrate them into society. They are poor, they are uneducated, they are underserved. I can't even really say underserved because of how much stuff they get from the state, but, they're just very different, okay? And their culture is different, and there's no sense of, unity or familiarity between them and their neighbors because the cultures are just so different. And so what ends up happening is you have a tight-knit, homogenous Somalian community, and they retain their identity and their culture from the country that they just fled from. They fail to integrate into the society that they've just come to. And because of that, they feel no loyalty or unity or connection to it or familiarity with it. And so they see it as alien. And that, I think, on some level motivates some of the antisocial scamming behavior that goes on. But also, the countries that they come from are full of scammers, full of crime, full of mischievous and Machiavellian and antisocial behavior. And they bring that here. And when they don't have to integrate in the society and they face no social repercussions for doing that, it incentivizes them to do it. And this is how you get scamming by the thousands. It is a complete failure of integration into the society. And we can make fun of them for being Muslim and African or whatever, but that kind of misses the forest for the trees. We need to understand this is a failure of integration, a complete and utter failure of integration. And then on top of that, they have the nerve to, wave the Somalian flag and call themselves Somalian and not identify with the nation, which just makes it even worse,
Problems with the grooming gang situation. But one of the main problems is that it's widespread in the community. And it's tolerated.
Because I know there's good Somalians. There's decent, hardworking, honest Somalians. I'm sure that there's plenty of them here. I'm sure there are, who have families and responsibilities. But the problem is when the cultural influence of that enclave overpowers the influence of the society and the influence or the pressure of assimilation, when the ethnic enclave's culture overrides the social expectation of assimilation and integration, you're going to have a micro community that is more loyal to one another and their own interests than assimilation. That's kind of the major issue. Because I'm sure you can find Somalians in, various parts of the country that are more well assimilated than the ones in Minneapolis, Minnesota, where they're so heavily concentrated in that one area. And they don't have the time to develop a uniquely American identity. I didn't have this issue because I didn't grow up in a Salvadoran or Black enclave, I grew up in a regular working class suburban neighborhood. So, I had a very traditional American upbringing. A lot of these people have a more unique, upbringing. A very Somalian upbringing, And yes, they live in America, but still very reminiscent of the country that they just came from. So they have a emotional attachment.
Community. The wives know about it, and we've got
and identify
interviews
that way.
With wives of convicted grooming gang members who will defend their husbands, saying, "Well, the girls deserved it," and things like this. And the number of men who have been a part of these trafficking networks is in the tens and thousands. It's just only the ringleaders get arrested. So large segments of this community are part of it. It's okay, well, we could be discerning about this and actually point out that this is not a community that is actually one that's very friendly to our way of life. It doesn't mean we have to just draw a hard line and say, right, every immigrant out, obviously, because we've got lots of immigrants here who are actually lovely and who have, every town in England has got an old Chinese restaurant, right? that is run by an old Chinese family and have never caused a problem in the entire time they've been here. Nobody would want to kick them out. Nobody would want to say, right, you can't be part of our community or anything like that. But there are manifest injustices that have been caused by certain communities that we just have to be able to talk about. We have to be able to hold to account. And unfortunately, Rupert Lowe got kicked out of the Reform Party for saying, look, everyone who knew about this should be deported. And if that means whole communities have to go, then whole communities have to go because they all bear the stain of the sin. And that's true. It's not necessarily like liberal individualism, but it is a real felt reality that people have to endure. And it's one of those questions whose time is rapidly approaching in Britain because people are angry, very angry.
They're angry, but at some level, and it's not just anger. I am shocked.
I think what's happening right now too is there's kind of a rude awakening. I think on some level, everybody wants to be kind of a liberal individualist. Nobody wants to be tribal. But I think what's happening here is people are developing a kind of group consciousness in the West as well. We are beginning to understand and become more aware of the diversity and the influence of multiculturalism on our society, and the fact that liberal individualism is just not sufficient to, like, we can all kind of get along and tolerate each other on the basis of individual differences, but to unify as a collective is a completely different task. And I think that people are now realizing that there's limits to liberalism and liberal individualism in terms of unifying a nation. And what's happening now is people are developing a group consciousness, and there's a lot of, and when I say group consciousness, I do mean like a racial, cultural, and ethnic consciousness. And people are beginning to use YouTube and social media platforms like X, where people were previously banned, to voice their opinions about these sorts of things. And I think there is kind of a collective awakening about this kind of stuff. And I think there's good to it, but I think there's good to it and bad to it. I think we need to understand that there are cultural differences and that these things are significant and they do matter and nations do matter. And we want to be able to recognize that without also sacrificing the values of liberalism and individualism that do kind of keep the peace within society, because that matters too. We're just trying to morph or synthesize the two of them, in a way that's more honest, in a way that's more genuine.
We are clearly like frogs being boiled slowly.
Because liberal individualism, I'm sorry, but liberal individualism is not, it's not enough. Like, liberal individualism is not a frame that's useful for understanding why Somalians in Minneapolis are defrauding Minnesota to the tune of billions of dollars. It's not like it's just a few individuals and, they're committing scams. No, like, there's something about that enclave and that culture and that group that is leading to this antisocial behavior. And liberal individualism is not a sufficient, it's like, oh, there's a couple of bad Somalian individuals. No, not when you have moms of 3 or 4 children sending their children to a QSP to get a fake autism diagnosis so they can get a kickback from a fraudulent clinic, and the whole community is in on it. Like, even the people who are not scammers, who are not filing the fake paperwork to make these kinds of, fake LLCs to get money from the government, even the families who are benefiting from that, but aren't the ringleaders of the whole operation, even they're in on it. And it's like, why? It's not like they're bad apples, but there's something about the community that is creating this influence, that is creating this incentive. It's something about the community and the culture that's creating that behavior. And like I said, liberal individualism doesn't explain that. It's like, oh, it's just a few bad individuals. No, there's a cultural and group pressure there that's not being accounted for when you only look at it through the context or through the lens of individual behavior. And yeah, I don't know. That's just, yeah.
Because things that are beyond unthinkable are now regular parts of the news cycle. Right? Like the idea that the medical establishment and the academic establishment are participating in a process that mutilates children for money due to gender madness.
Yeah.
It really is. It's hard to avoid Mengele-like parallels when we.
It's unforgivable.
Yeah.
It's unforgivable.
It's beyond unforgivable. It is. Yeah. It is exactly the sort of thing that you think is so far beyond the possible that you don't need to worry about it until it arrives, and it's happening all the time, and people are being thrown off of, social media for talking about it, and people are the whole idea that civilization is not only doing this, but it is immunizing it from proper scrutiny is. It's hard to even think about how to describe a world that upside down. And the grooming gang phenomenon is exactly the same thing. Like, how is it that such a pattern is allowed to happen, let alone that it should be controversial as to whether or not you have a right to even notice the basic pattern, where it's coming from? Of course, anybody who knew about this and didn't act to stop it shouldn't be in your country. It doesn't. These are not extreme positions, but they're painted as extreme positions because something unholy has taken over the job of deciding what we're allowed to think.
And in my country, there are so many people who go to jail over merely having a conversation like this. I think I'll be okay with you because I'm cautious and discreet about the language that I use. A lot of what I'm saying is kind of has heavy implications and overtones rather than me saying the things explicitly. But that's because I'm lucky enough to have the education and the skills to be able to do that. A lot of people who don't have the education and skills are saying basically exactly the same thing as me, just in a much more blunt way, and the government sends them to jail for saying such things. And it's a horrific state of injustice. This is the law in this country. The law is designed to prevent the negative characterization of communities that engage in mass rape. And it's like, okay, I mean, we can't, in polite society, be honest about this. And this is one of the reasons that I'm something of a pariah, right? Because I'm prepared to actually say these things. And I'm not trying to be offensive. I'm not trying to attack anyone. But an honest accounting of what has happened and what the establishment and the powers that be have allowed to happen for decades, I think an accurate summary of it is what I've just described. And I don't think I'm being hyperbolic in the slightest.
No, I think you're being very careful. And it's crazy to me that you have to be so careful. I do think even if it is hard to make the case in concrete terms, the First and Second Amendments to the American Constitution seem to be the last bulwark against absolute tyranny and madness. And I do consider it absolute tyranny for people to be thrown in jail for tweeting in response to obvious and egregious patterns of behavior. You have to be able to talk about these things, frankly. You have to be able to say wrong things and over-the-top things. That's part of how we figure out what's actually right and appropriate. So anyway, I worry for you all that you don't have a constitution that protects you in this regard. I know that ours is absolutely galling to those who wish to tyrannize us, and that they spend a lot of time trying to figure out how to whittle it away and potentially to torch it if they can only figure out an excuse that we will buy. But for the moment, we still have those rights. What do you think, what is going to become of England in light of the absurd rules you have to abide by?
So I think there's something of an ethnic consciousness that is arising in the English. I don't think they're formally aware that that's what they're doing, but the current political environment is splitting into two camps, where you have England split into two main blocks. The block that is doing quite well for themselves vote for the Liberal Democrats, and they're going to be the opposition party, it looks like, after the next Parliament. And the block that is not doing very well will be voting for Nigel Farage. Now, none of this is couched in these ethnic terms, but when you look at a map of England and you see the future seat projections, it's hard not to see it that way, because the inner cities that have been diversified through mass immigration, they all vote for the Green Party or the Labour Party. It'll be mostly the Green Party next time, because the Labour Party is heading for a historic wipeout. And so outside of these sort of islands of green, it's just yellow or blue, whether it's Liberal, Democrat, or Reform. And so the whole thing, it takes on a rather ethnic character, and it feels like it is the English saying, we've had enough of the politics of the 20th century. The old parties can die, and we want some real change here. Or if you're in the yellow, the much smaller area in the southwest that's quite wealthy and not very diversified, you don't want any change because your life is going great. But unfortunately for you, 2/3 of the country are not happy with how things are going, and they've had it up to here, and so we're gonna probably get Nigel Farage if everything carries on, and it's possible that Nigel Farage does something useful. If nothing else, breaking the old consensus in politics is as good a thing as any. Because, of course, for anyone who isn't aware, the 20th century was dominated by the Conservative Party and the Labour Party. This was essentially the only parties that would ever form governments, and breaking that, and it's very much like Republicans and Democrats in the United States, for anyone who doesn't know, but breaking the stranglehold they had on the political system is as much a useful thing as anything that Nigel Farage will do. Now, Nigel Farage, he's not very radical. He's centre-right. He's not an insane lunatic or anything. They're trying to paint him as Hitler. He's not Hitler. He's just, honestly, he's not entirely dissimilar to Piers Morgan in a lot of his political positions, to be honest. He's really not. But he is a patriot, and he does want Britain to do well and be independent of the European Union, which is why he led the Brexit campaign. And he probably will try and restore Britain to a point in time in the past where he felt that things were working as they ought to be working. And that'll be a noble goal. And if he can roll back a bunch of these laws, because a lot of the laws that are used to tyrannize us aren't that old. Constitutional innovations into Britain's sort of living constitution that came within my lifetime, from about 1997 onwards to about the sort of 2010s. They're really not that old, and they could just be repealed like that, because the advantage of having a written constitution like you have is you have solid protections against your government. However, it also means you're kind of locked into place in a series of issues that you can't actually maneuver quickly on, and it would take what is essentially an insurmountable percentage of the population to vote in a particular direction to get an amendment and to get change. Well, we are in a different position where we don't have the same constitution protections, but actually the parliament is literally sovereign, and is able to change the laws in any way it sees fit. Now, most of the time, you don't have a radical party come in and make radical changes, because we had a much more genteel political environment. The other fellow, he might have lost, but he's not your enemy. He still has a legitimate claim, and so you don't want to just trample all over him, because one day you're probably going to lose as yourself, and he'll just trample all over you. Well, this is what the Labour Party, which is our Democrats, did in the 90s. They decided the other fellow doesn't have a legitimate claim. We're going to institute a series of very radical laws, the sort of laws that the Democrats would love to institute in your country, actually, to criminalize negatively characterizing certain groups, speaking in certain ways, installing a series of kind of extra legal bodies that would also manage the civilization according to the rule of experts. And the fact that these were put in by Parliament means they can just be removed by Parliament. And so what it looks like is that Nigel Farage will actually try what is the meme of it going around is called the Great Repeal Bill, which is basically just undo everything from about 1997 onwards. And that would be a good start. That'd be a very good start. And if he can get that done, that would be great. I'm not saying I'm very optimistic. I'm not saying he's going to do it, but he has made noises in this direction. We're still, 4 years out? 3 years? No, 4 years out. Nearly 3 years out from the next election. So a lot of things could change in that time. So this could be a political analysis, and it ages very poorly. But the problem with Britain is that things happen very slowly here. Just to get the majority of the population away from voting Labour and the Conservatives was a huge milestone, a huge milestone. And the fact that Farage might do something to turn the ship of state, superb, fantastic. We just have to endure until that point, basically. But I'm actually moderately optimistic for the way things are. I'm a bit nervous for America, actually. Yeah. I'm genuinely worried about the Democrats. They're starting to find their feet again. They're starting to claw back a few wins. And, I don't like the Republican Party, but I like Republicans a lot. And especially the kind of like those sort of original constitutional types who really adhere to the true founding values of America. That's what I think.
The whole Constitution LARP is really funny because we have a constitutional party. It's pretty conservative. It's super conservative, actually. But we have a constitutional party already, and it gets no votes. I think at the point that we're at now, it's been, 250 years since the founding of the country. When I say founding, I mean formal founding of the country, depending on where the demarcation is, if it's 1776 or 1783. But it's been 250 years since the Constitution was drafted, and it's like people's priorities now are not just the Constitution. It's like immigration, it's demographics, it's the culture, it's so many other things that matter beyond just the Constitution. So I think the Constitution LARP is kind of dead. I mean, they're cool people, don't get me wrong, but that's not why people are voting. People are not voting because this party's going to uphold the Constitution. That's not a thing. In fact, people cheer on violations of the law and the Constitution when it benefits their side.
I think a real American should actually think and the way they should behave. And I think that there's a kind of timeless truth in it. And so I'm sorry you guys are saddled with the Republican Party to embody those values, basically. And I think that one day you guys need to go through the sort of process we've gone through, which is basically junking the old party and starting afresh, starting for something that we feel more adequately represents what we actually want.
Wouldn't that be nice?
I'm genuinely worried about the future of America, because it seems that there are so many people in America who would rather live in the European Union. And I don't know whether you've noticed, but the European Union is not a healthy organization. It's a very dysfunctional political organization because it's very artificial. And makes a series of promises and then tyrannizes you with these promises in the most hypocritical of ways. Whenever you see Ursula von der Leyen complaining about democracy in Hungary or in America or wherever, she was never elected to anything. That's an unelected position she is lecturing you from. It's honestly, it's vile, absolutely vile to see it. But they have the opinion that they're morally superior to the Americans, and I just don't agree. I just don't agree with that at all. And they live in this kind of, sorry, I know I'm going on, but this is just, it just really annoys me how they talk about free speech. I mean, it's just the European Union does not have free speech. Britain does not have free speech. There's just no concept of it at all, and they don't have a tradition of it. They don't respect it as a value. And so when JD Vance came over and lectured them on it, no wonder one or two of them cried, because they realized we're going to have to accept a different value system that's much closer to the sort of old English value system. You know, it's something that's quite alien to these people. So anyway, I'll stop talking about it. Like, I'm worried that America goes down, frankly. I'm genuinely worried about it.
You are right to be worried. And unfortunately, I think the Democratic Party, which is the party that I am a member of, but I think it is so unforgivably corrupt and anti-American that it must be replaced. The good of the nation requires it. And the Republican Party is despicable in its own right. It's just absolutely awful. Donald Trump managed to bring the Democratic Party to its knees and to decapitate the Republican Party. So in some sense, it had the promise of the replacement of these two ancient corrupt parties. But the way he has governed has perplexed many of us. It's like he is under some kind of control, which is, of course, also fueling the Groypers, their suspicion that actually our democracy is a fiction. Which, you know, our democracy is a fiction at one level or another, because at the very least, corruption overrides the will of the governed again and again. But there are legitimate questions about why it is that governance fails to do the bidding of the people. For one thing, it is painfully obvious to me that a party that simply committed itself to doing what was in the interest of the public as well as it could figure out what that was would be unstoppable. It would be unbelievably popular. And the fact that neither party embraces this approach is because they have a higher calling. They are servicing their actual constituents, which has nothing to do with the public. The public is an inconvenience to them. So anyway, yeah, you're not wrong to be worried about us.
No, you're totally right on that. And I've got a great example that proves your point. In fact, Rupert Lowe was a member of Parliament for Reform. Nigel Farage kind of a bit slightly backstabbed him and kicked him out because he said that, you know, entire communities need to be deported if they are complicit in the rape gangs. That was too far for Nigel Farage because, like I said, he's not a radical. He's quite soft on many issues actually. But Rupert Lowe started a party. He's a constituent for he's the MP for a constituency called Great Yarmouth, which is
the fact that is considered extreme is kind of I don't know, because it's like on one hand, like, let's say if you have like a random 20 to 23-year-old dad, he's a business owner in the UK and he has a family, and there is prominent rape gangs in his community, but they are patrons to his store, and, you know, they exist in the community, and he knows the family that, you know, the family that this, you know, particular group of rape gang, whatever, the sons, he knows the family that is connected to these rape gangs. We'll just put it that way. And he does not tell local law enforcement about this particular behavior because he doesn't want to put his own family in harm's way or, you know, potentially risk his own business being targeted. Should that person be deported? Maybe. You know, I don't know. You know, that's a difficult philosophical question. But I think with the people who are complicit in it in a more direct and in a more intentional way, I think those people should be deported. I think that's totally fair. It's a hard question, but I actually don't think that that's crazy. To ask that question and to consider that, I actually don't think that's crazy. And if the guy did lose his business and get deported, it'd be like, well, you know, you should have said something.
Is an old English seaside town, and it, in the Victorian era, because
like I wouldn't feel bad for him.
Didn't exist. It was thriving, and then come the middle of the 20th century, with air travel becoming something, the sort of middle to late 20th century, it declined, like all of the English seaside towns have, because you can just go to Spain or something like that in a couple of hours, right? And so it's these seaside towns are kind of not limped along. They're not doing that badly, but there's a decline there. There's an element of decline in them. But these people are good, hardworking, patriotic people, and they look at the way that the country's going and say, no, we're going to vote for the right-wing party because we know who we are, we know what we want. And so Rupert Lowe sits as the independent MP for Great Yarmouth, and he decided, you know what, I'm going to start the Great Yarmouth First Party, because and he's genuinely the best MP we've got. He donates his entire salary to a local charity every month, just to help people out in the constituency. And he started the Great Yarmouth First Party. And the first I heard of it was on the day it was released. It started polling at 44% in that constituency, miles above any of the other parties that run about 13, 14, 19%. And then there's his new Great Yarmouth First Party, it's 44%. Because you're exactly right. People would love to have political representation that actually was working in their interests. And Rupert Lowe has a really solid track record of working in their interests. So they can look at him and say, oh, right, great. He is actually our man. He is, and it's very small scale. It's just one constituency out of 650. It's not very big. It's not very powerful. But it probably will end up returning Great Yarmouth First politicians for the foreseeable future. And so, okay, that's interesting, because why can't the constituency next to it have that party first? Why can't, where I live, Swindon North, why can't that, well, Perthon technically, but like Swindon North, why can't we have a Swindon North first? And so suddenly you're outside of the era of the great parties now. Now you're into local alliances that are agreed to vote on a certain subject in a certain way. And so actually you can turn politics, there is a mechanism here to turn politics to something that actually serves us, rather than some great national party with various mega interests that come in the top. And so, like I said, I realize that Britain, things are bad at the moment, right? But I can see the shoots of spring, pushing up through the snow, and I'm kind of optimistic about the future. It's just going to be a long struggle to get there.
Well, I hope you're right.
I do too. I'm an optimist at heart, though. I have to say, I've always been a natural optimist. Well, so maybe I'm wrong.
I appreciate your optimism. No, I mean, the problem is, the West is looking awfully rickety, and with it back on its heels on both sides of the pond, the future looks pretty bleak, frankly. So anyway, if you see England as potentially turning the corner, that's excellent news to me.
Things are going to get worse before they get better, but the potential to get better is there. But one thing I guess we could finish on this is like this has always, I think, been the issue. And you made a point earlier that rights claims create distance between people. And I think that's a great point that's not sufficiently explored, right? The rights claim, if you're just making a claim against the central government for rights, then what you're not doing is talking to the people around you. What you're not doing is engaging with the people, negotiating with them, asking them, what do you want? What do I get in return? You're not going through the actual steps that make society what it is. And so it's a constant process of atomization. And what it also does is it means you don't develop good character, because in that negotiation with your neighbor, you're not making rights claims. I mean, you are in a sense, but you're also making a friendship. You're also forming a bond. You're also beginning to care. And this modulates the kind of person you become. And so going back to the example of George Washington, the thing that jumps out is his tremendously good character. He was a trustworthy and predictable man. Everyone knew the kind of man that he was, and he was a great model. Honestly, if you guys didn't have George Washington, you probably wouldn't have the republic that you have, right?
I agree. He refused to be king. He was a hero. Exactly. They would have made him king, and he refused it.
Exactly. It would be something else entirely. And this speaks to the importance of character in just daily life. Like, you have great examples like Washington, but everyone also knows someone in their own life who is of good character, who they didn't realize everyone was relying on because they were of good character. And then this is one of those points that Jordan Peterson makes, but I don't think people give sufficient weight to it. It's like, look, this is what being the rock on which other people rely on is. It's being that man of good character. And the more of us who and character isn't something you just switch on and off. You develop it over a long period of time. It is genuinely, going back to Aristotle, is your habit. It is the habit of a lifetime. And the quicker and the more consistently you develop these good habits, and you be a good man, and you be the kind of person you would be proud of meeting, the better things become. This is like, you can't just make rights claims against the government and expect your life to get better, but you can start exercising your own will to become a man of good character. And you set an example for others around you. You start making other people realize they can be good men of good character too. And suddenly the civilization starts knitting itself back together. Regardless of what the government does, you will always have that bedrock of men and women of good character to fall back on. And that's where I think saving the West really is. That's what it really is, I think. Us being good people. I know that sounds unsexy in a lot of ways, but like, I really think it's that simple, but also that hard.
No, I think this is really good. It also, if you think about what rights claims are in that story,
Hmm.
They are cryptically citizens weaponizing the government against each other, right? In other
Yes.
words, to the extent that the point is, well, I'm entitled to be doing better than I am, so what I'm going to do is target some other group, and I'm going to leverage my political capital to get taxes raised that will pay for the thing that I want. It's antithetical to the West and especially to the American ethos. Really, the idea of the American founders was to get government as corralled as possible, right? At the point that the government is the thing that you need, there's been a failure, right?
Yep.
More or less what you want is some basic agreement on what the rights of a person are, and therefore, by extension, what the rights of a community are. And then the process you're talking about where, you and your neighbors reach an agreement by whatever mechanism in which you treat each other some way. And as long as you're not, over the bounds of the law, the government shouldn't be involved. But instead, I think our affection for each other has failed. We are strangers to each other, and therefore it is very tempting to use the government to extract something from others in order to better you. And that's the road to hell. We really have to avoid the pull of that inclination.
No, you're totally right, and it all just comes down to giving the other guy his due. What does he deserve, actually? And if he gives you your due, how are you even in an argument now? You'll come to it'll be very easy to find a reasonable settlement between yourselves, and you didn't have to invoke a lawsuit. You didn't have to call the police. You just have to be considerate of one another. And I realize this doesn't sound very exciting. Like, this sounds like the sort of thing your grandmother would have told you. But that's because it's true. Like, it's genuinely how the thing works, and it's the only way to make a good civilization. I really believe it.
All right. That is a beautiful note to end on. I resonate with it wholeheartedly. Carl Benjamin, it has been a real pleasure talking to you, and I will make sure that a link to your piece on Nick Fuentes is in the description to this video. And anyway, I hope this is the first of many conversations.
So do I. I've been waiting many years for this conversation, actually, because I appreciate all of the sort of intellectual dark web types. I've always respected all of them, but I've always noticed that you're the one who's prepared to ask the hard questions, right, and not look for the easy answers. And I'm not trying to slight anyone when I say that, because it's natural that you feel comfortable in a particular set of answers. But it was always you who I paid most attention to, because you were the one who was most prepared to do the difficult intellectual work, and I've always really respected that. So thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. That was a very high compliment, and I will cherish it. All right.
Brilliant.
Thanks, Carl, and be well, everyone.
Cool. All right. Well, that's that. Let me switch back to full screen. I mean, honestly, I don't know what else to add on to that other than the fact that, like, everybody knows that there is something special about the West and the civilization, in spite of its history. I mean, every civilization has a brutal history. But people know there's something special about the civilization worth preserving, worth fighting for, worth defending. And I think that is a positive impulse, okay? Because that impulse in and of itself, I think, is enough of a sign of good faith. I mean, we can bicker about the solutions, but that is a good basis to begin negotiations. I think all of us want what's best for the civilization in this country, especially. And it begins with that. It begins with that kind of good faith. And I like the way they ended it, understanding that good character is essential, and promoting good character, Lord have mercy, promoting good character is necessary in terms of ensuring the survival of our country. God forbid. That is huge. The only thing is, the last thing I'll say is, I think Carl and Brett did a really good job already understanding the rise of Fuentes and the situation that we're in right now in this country, and, the issues that we have culturally. I need people to understand how important it is to, and I know this is cliche, but it's just true. Understand that people are willing to hear you out. People are willing to hear you out, okay? In spite of what Twitter and YouTube say, and the differences that might seem irreconcilable between the left and the right, people are willing to listen to your grievances and understand where you're coming from if you give them the opportunity to. I think most people are moderate. I don't think everybody is this extremist, online, hateful individual who wants the death of a particular group of people. I don't actually think that's accurate. So anyways, the point I'm making is just try to have good faith, try to have hope and optimism in spite of the craziness that you see on the internet and on X especially. But yeah, I'm gonna leave it at that. Thank you guys for watching this video. I appreciate you guys. If you enjoyed it, please like, subscribe, leave a comment, share, and until further ado, I'm out.